Good afternoon. It is March 7th, 2023. Welcome to the San Marino Unified School District Board of Education special meeting. Here is your board president, Shelley Ryan.
Thank you and welcome. The San Marino Unified School District Board of Education special meeting. This is a meeting where all meetings of the Board of Education are open to members of the public unless publicly noticed as a confidential closed session as allowed by the Law Education Code Section 35147. Members of the public may address the board as outlined in the public comment section of the agenda. The audio of all meetings is recorded, and a member of the public may be held liable for any slanderous or otherwise defamatory statements. In consideration of the board and members of the audience, please turn off or silence your cell phones while in the boardroom. The San Marino Unified School District encourages those with disabilities to participate fully in the public meeting process. If you need a disability-related modification or accommodation, including an auxiliary aids or services to participate in the public meeting, please contact the assistant to the superintendent at jdelatorre@smusd.us or at 626-299-7000 extension 1310. At least 48 hours before the school board meeting so that we may make every reasonable effort to accommodate you under Government Code 54953.2, Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Documents provided to a majority of the Board of Education regarding an open session item on this agenda will be made available for public inspection in the district office located at 1665 West Drive, San Marino during normal business hours. In addition, such writings and documents may be viewed on the district's website at www.smusd.us. I'd like to open the session. It is now 1:04. Call to order, Pledge of Allegiance. This is a procedural item. Please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, a nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. May I have an approval of the agenda?
I move to approve the agenda.
Second. Thank you, Mrs. Chong. Thank you, Mrs. Gill. Motion passes. I would like to take a roll call vote. Ms. Lamb? Aye. Mrs. Gill? Aye. Mrs. Chong?
Aye.
Mr. Chang?
Aye.
Mrs. Ryan? Aye. Motion passes. Public comment. The Board of Education has adopted Board Policy 9323B to ensure the public's right to be heard in any matters pertaining to the San Marino Unified School District. Public comment is limited to only those items listed on the special meeting agenda. Persons who wish to provide public comment will have three options to submit public comments. First, you may submit through an online form. Are there any? No comments have been received. Request to speak during the meeting via Zoom and request to speak during the meeting in person via the public comment card. The public may submit public comments for the board study session on March 7th, 2023 from 10 a.m. through 12 p.m. The comments we did not receive any during this time and will not be read during the meeting, but will always be provided to the Board of Education. During public comment, the meeting will pause for 1 minute to take requests to speak. The raise hand function is used to take requests during the public comment period. For online attendees, press the raise hand icon to add yourself to the queue. For phone attendees, dial *9. The speaking order will be determined based on the order of requests received. Individual speakers will be unmuted and called to speak. Dr. Choi?
Thank you, President Ryan. We're pausing for 1 minute to take requests to speak regarding matters on the agenda. If you'd like to make a request to speak, please press the raise hand icon, dial *9, or submit a public comment card. Thirty seconds remain. If you'd like to make a request to speak, please press the raise hand icon or dial *9. We have no requests.
Thank you, Dr. Choi. At this time, I would like to talk about the request to speak during the meeting in person via the public comment card. Please complete the public comment card and submit the completed card to the designated drop box with the assistant to the superintendent no later than when the agenda section board study session is called by the board president. There will be opportunities for public comment, and they're offered at the start of the board study session only for matters on the agenda. The Board of Education reserves the right to add a public comment period prior to any individual item on the agenda. 5 minutes may be allotted to each speaker and a maximum of 20 minutes for each subject matter. However, in the event there are more than 4 speakers on the same subject, board president retains the discretion to adjust and limit the time allocated to each speaker to ensure that all wishing to speak will be heard within the 20-minute allotment. Communication from the audience regarding matters on the agenda are to be made at this time. At this time, there are no requests. Board study session and the Board of Education will now participate in the board study session. This is a discussion item only. Okay. First, we will have special education. Should I read that or you want that?
No.
Okay, why don't you start? I will turn it over to Dr. Linda Delatorre.
Thank you, President Ryan, members of the Board of Education, our executive team members. As to the topic of special education, we have here this afternoon Attorney David Salazar, who is here from one of our law firms, F3. David Salazar is a partner in the firm's Los Angeles office, where he practices in the area of student services and special education litigation. He focuses on providing guidance on and complying with provisions of the IDEA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, as well as assisting clients in preparing for IEP meetings and manifestation determinations. He also represents clients in due process hearings before the Office of Administrative Hearing and on appeal. We also have our Director of Special Education Services, Mrs. Rocky Komar, who is here to answer any questions. And with that, I'd like to ask Mr. Salazar to please join us at the podium.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, members of the board, executive team. Thank you for having me this afternoon. We will begin our presentation today with a general outline of what we intend to cover, but I want to caution you before I get into these 4 topic areas that any of these 4 topic areas would warrant their own multiple hour training, right? I'm giving you a very abbreviated big picture view of what it takes to comply with special education. So bear that in mind as we go through our presentation, that we're not going into granular level today, although I'm happy to answer any questions that the board may have. So the 4 topic areas that we're going to cover today are starting with the district's obligation to provide a free, appropriate public education. You'll hear me refer to that as a FAPE. And one thing about special education that will warn you in advance is we use a lot of acronyms. There are a ton of acronyms. So if at any point I use an acronym and I don't clarify in advance, please don't hesitate to ask what I mean by that. And so essentially that will be a discussion about what it is that the district is required to do in order to provide a FAPE. We will then briefly touch on the topic of how we get to FAPE, meaning from the moment we identify a child as requiring an IEP through placing that student in an appropriate placement. We will then discuss parent rights. Very generally, again, just the kinds of things that parents can request, and how the district is obligated to respond to those requests and what procedures need to be followed when it comes to responding to parent requests. And then finally, we will talk about the due process procedures. When I say due process, I mean that is when a student has filed a complaint with the Office of Administrative Hearings against the district, alleging that the district has denied their child a FAPE. So we'll talk about generally what that process looks like, as well as what are some of the considerations that we weigh just very generally in deciding how to proceed with a case after it's been filed. So I think the best place to start is really to understand the sources of the law and how special education operates. We start always with what's called the IDEA. That stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004. That's the federal law that sets forth the requirement that school districts, in order to receive public funding, must provide students with disabilities a free, appropriate public education. There are regulations, so the law usually speaks very generally, and then there are regulations that fill in those gaps that the law may not address. There are also, separate from the federal law, California as a state adopts its own set of laws, usually in harmony with the IDEA. Oftentimes what may happen is that the IDEA may be the floor of what the federal government requires for a student with disabilities, and then the state can set a higher bar or a lower bar or the same bar. But California has adopted regulations and a section of the education code that addresses what is required in the state of California in order to provide a child with a FAPE. And then finally, as with the IDEA, the general provisions of the Ed Code that address special education are also governed by regulations that fill in the gaps that the code leaves blank. In the center of all this, you have the Office of Administrative Hearings, and we'll talk a little bit about OAH in a second, as well as the courts who hear the cases, decide the cases, and decisions that courts issue, as well as decisions that OAH issue, will give us guidance as to how the law should be interpreted and applied. So let's start with the district's obligation to provide a FAPE. So the IDEA requires a district to provide FAPE to children with disabilities, and children with disabilities is a broad definition. It includes children with intellectual disabilities, hearing impairments, including deafness, speech or language impairments, visual impairments, including blindness, emotional disturbance, orthopedic impairments, or other orthopedic impairments, autism, traumatic brain injury, other health impairments, which is an umbrella that captures a variety of disabilities, as well as specific learning disabilities. And in addition to having a disability, in order to be entitled to a FAPE, the student has to require special education in order to access the curriculum. So what I mean by that is that you may have a child with a disability, but their disability is not preventing them from accessing the curriculum, and so therefore they would not require special education. So it's a two-prong analysis, right? First prong is you have to have a disability. Second prong is you have to need special education. So what is FAPE? And I mean, I guess we're all trying to figure out what FAPE is all the time, because it is a bit of amorphous at times, and it really is what the courts interpret FAPE to be. But generally, it's comprised of two components. There's a procedural prong of the things that the district has to follow, certain procedures, certain timelines, certain processes that have to be in place in the process of working through an IEP, in the process of responding to parent requests, in the process of assessing. So there's certain processes that have to be followed. But then we also look at the substance, right? When we talk about substance, what we're talking about is, does this IEP offer the appropriate amount of services, the goals and the areas of need that are necessary? The substance of what's written in that IEP document is the substantive prong. And so in order to achieve FAPE, you have to comply with both, although as we'll talk about in a minute, a procedural violation of the IDA doesn't always result in a denial of FAPE, meaning there are certain things that where we deviate from the process and the consequences are not that you're found out of compliance and liable to a family. It's generally that procedure isn't followed, and we try to improve our processes to make sure we follow procedure. The substantive prong of FAPE is really the focus, I think, of the vast majority of the work that we do. And the standard used to be, and it's been modified since, but it used to be that FAPE was an IEP that was reasonably calculated to provide a student with some educational benefit. It was defined as a basic floor of opportunity. It did not require you to provide the best IEP possible. But it had to be more than just trivial advancement, right? It wasn't just enough to offer something. You had to make an effort to provide the child with some opportunity to make progress. Since then, the Supreme Court has further narrowed or further defined what FAPE means. And now, under a decision called the Andrew F. decision, that's the current governing decision on what FAPE is. FAPE is now an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances. And what you'll hear me say sometimes is progress appropriate in light of their unique circumstances, because the law acknowledges that students with disabilities are unique. And that's why we individualize their education for them. And we take those unique circumstances into account. The law acknowledges that not all children with disabilities are going to be able to make the same type of progress as their non-disabled peers. And many of them may not even be able to make the same amount of progress as their non-disabled peers. So when we're looking at them, what we're really looking at them is, what are your unique circumstances as a child? What are your unique disabilities, your unique needs? How do we serve them? And then we measure progress based on the progress you're making on those unique needs, as opposed to compare you with your peers in a general education environment. The program has to be ambitious. It has to be appropriately ambitious, meaning we can't just sandbag our goals and offer something that we know a child can meet within a month and then say, we're going to take this whole year to get you there, right? It has to be appropriately ambitious. But again, we're looking at whether the offer that is made in that IEP is reasonable. We're not looking to see whether it is ideal. As I mentioned earlier, a procedural violation can rise to a denial of FAPE under certain circumstances, and those circumstances are usually when it impedes the right to a FAPE, meaning if you withhold information that you're procedurally required to provide the parents, and as a result, the parents can't make an educated decision about their child's programming, that may be a situation where there may be a procedural violation. And every case is unique, but that's an example. There's also situations where you significantly impede the parent's right to meaningfully participate in the decision-making process. And that would be, for example, in an IEP meeting, withholding information that the district has in its assessment reports. Like, for example, you do an assessment, you don't provide the assessment report to the family or review the results, and yet you make decisions at an IEP meeting that the parent has no background information in order to determine whether the decisions that you're making are in their children's best interest. So that would be a potential scenario where that might be impeding the parent's right, or where it causes education deprivation or educational deprivation, meaning you've delayed a process that should have been started earlier. As a result, the child does not get the services they need when they need to. And it's that delay when there's more than just a de minimis delay that could potentially rise to a denial of FAPE. But we're really looking at processes. We're not yet looking at what the IEP is made up of, if that makes sense. The procedural prong of FAPE, I think more often than not, we see it in the context of deadlines. There are a lot of deadlines in special education that your staff has to be mindful of. The team has to be mindful of their timeline to convene an IEP meeting when a parent requests it, which is usually 30 days, except whenever the district is on break for more than 5 days. The obligation to send out an assessment plan within 15 days of a parent's request, again, not including breaks of 5 days or more. more than 5 days. Completing an assessment and convening an IEP meeting to review the results. You have to do that within 60 days, with that carve out of days that school's not in session. And then convening annual IEPs, meaning every year to review the IEP and determine whether it continues to be appropriate and make changes to ensure that it continues to be appropriate. So and there are also, by the way, other implicit deadlines that aren't so clear. One of them, for example, is if you receive a request for something called an independent educational evaluation. That's generally an evaluation done by an outside third party at the parent's request, funded by the school district. And the parent can request at any time they disagree with the findings of a district's assessment. There is no specific deadline for responding to a request for an IE, but you have to do it without undue delay or without unreasonable delay. And so what that means, some of course interpret it to mean, within 60 days, others interpret it to mean within 6 months, but you have to be mindful that you've got this request and you've got to respond to it within a reasonable period of time. So we're balancing all these timelines. And in some circumstances, if you don't comply with a timeline and it results in impeding the parent's right or depriving them of an opportunity to participate in the IEP process, you might find yourself in a situation where somebody's going to allege that you've denied a FAPE. So that's the procedural and the substantive aspect of the IEP process. More often than not, right, the IEP process starts at the point where we identify a child as having a disability. And that obligation is called a child find obligation. And in essence, under the IDEA, a district has a duty to identify, locate, and evaluate all children within its jurisdiction or within its boundaries who have disabilities and who are in need of special education. This includes in California, it includes homeless children who live within your boundaries. It includes wards of the state who may live within your boundaries, and children who, although they may not live in San Marino, they come to private schools within the boundaries of San Marino. So the way we do that is through two different ways. So the first one is by putting out information. So our obligation is to put out public notice, have a liaison in place that will work with the private school so that if the private school comes across a child that they believe might have a disability and may need an assessment, they know who to call within the district to get that assessment done. And so it's our obligation to put out information the same way you have notices for other things within your district, put out information for parents and the public to know how to get an IEP if they need one. But then there's also the obligation that's triggered for the children that we come into contact day to day. Whenever we think that whenever we suspect a disability or have reason to believe that a disability exists, we have an obligation to evaluate those children to determine whether they are eligible for special education because they might need an IEP to access the curriculum. So again, it's both the public notice piece, which is going to inform the public of how to get an IEP, but also the specific duty to evaluate children within our schools that we come across that we believe may have a disability or have reason to believe they have a disability or know that they have a disability. And by the way, when I say, believe that they have a disability or know that they have a disability, we don't make the decision of whether or not we think it's affecting them. We have to evaluate them. So if we suspect a disability, there's an obligation to evaluate. Whether it turns out that they need special education is a separate question, but that should not prevent us from evaluating a child if we think they have a disability but don't think they need an IEP. Yes.
When you say child, what age?
So our obligation to begin assessing is usually when they turn 3. So prior to 3, they are served by regional center. And so regional center will usually let the district know children that are getting ready to turn 3 so that the district can assess and begin providing services to those children that meet the IDEA. And that obligation continues through age 22. And so it's after age 22 that then the regional center and other governmental public entities will take over serving individuals with disabilities. And there's a list, and I went through it earlier, of different areas that a child may be eligible under, and each category has a standard, a legal standard that has to be met. I think I mentioned earlier that other health impairment is an umbrella of disabilities that covers, for example, processing disorders. It covers things like anxiety. It covers attention deficit disorder. If you have a diagnosis of a child with attention deficit disorder and you know about it, you would typically assess them and determine whether that attention deficit disorder is preventing them from accessing the curriculum. And if it does, then there would be entitled to special education. If it doesn't, if they're able to manage, then it would not necessarily entitle them to an IEP. But as you can see, the list of areas where a child can be found eligible is quite lengthy, and there are sub areas within those areas. So there could be a lot of different reasons why a child is eligible for special education. Under that Andrew F. standard, if you remember, I talked about the importance of the child's unique circumstances. We build the programming based on those unique circumstances, and we write it so it's reasonably calculated to allow them to make progress based on those circumstances. The assessment piece is a foundational piece of providing a FAPE, because it's the assessment that will tell you what those child's unique circumstances are. They'll tell you where their strengths and weaknesses are, and they'll give you a profile of that child's unique circumstances so that you can then tailor the IEP, if they are eligible for special education, tailor them to those unique circumstances. The assessment process is designed to obtain information, to determine eligibility, to determine educational needs that the IEP will serve, to determine appropriate services and supports, as well as ultimately where the child will be placed as part of the IEP. Assessments are governed by two provisions of the Ed Code. The first looks to the substance, more to the substance, but there's some procedural elements to this of the assessment. It looks at whether or not the assessment is truly comprehensive, meaning did we assess in all areas of suspected disability and related areas of need within those areas of suspected disability. So an example may be a child with autism. We would obviously do a psychological assessment. We call it psychoeducational assessment, but we may also consider doing a speech and language assessment, because there is a significant number of students with autism who also have speech and language related needs. And so we would want to do that evaluation as well, since it's an area that may be related to that area of disability. It also speaks to the qualification of assessors, right? There are certain people that can do certain assessments and other people cannot. And so whenever we have someone do an assessment, we have to ensure that that individual meets the qualifications to conduct that assessment. It speaks to how you select testing instruments. They have to be administered for the purpose for which they were designed, and for the specific purpose for which we've selected them. And you can't just randomly start administering every assessment you can find. There's got to be a strategy to this. Then there's also questions about information that it must be yielded during the course of the evaluation. So all of this is governed by one statute. Then there's a separate statute that then tells us what needs to be in those reports that we generate at the end of that evaluation. And that statute lays out some questions that need to be answered by the report, as well as specific information that needs to be included that wouldn't come to mind. Like, for example, a health and development background for a child is generally part of an assessment. And oftentimes when we do something like a speech and language assessment, we might not be thinking about health and development, but the code requires it. So we have to be mindful of not just honing in so much in our assessment, but then also making sure that when we generate a report, that report meets all the elements of the education code. Because those are the kinds of things that we will look at when we later have to decide if a parent were to request an independent education evaluation, whether it's warranted, because we may not have done something we need to do, although that's not always the primary reason why IEEs are granted. IEE is an independent education evaluation. As with all requests in special education, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, there's a multitude of factors that we consider. But obviously, if we get an assessment and we realize from the very beginning that it's missing some of these elements, then we might be better suited granting that request. And the reason for that is very unique to special education assessments, If a parent makes a request for an independent educational evaluation and you deny that request and the student still lives within your boundaries, you're required to file to defend your assessment. So you take on the burden of proof to go into a hearing and prove that your assessment meets all the substantive and procedural requirements of the law. And so sometimes the calculation is, going through that process and the cost you will incur versus the cost of funding an IEE that may be significantly less than that. That's not always the case. Oftentimes we have to file for other reasons that are completely unrelated to the cost benefit analysis, but that is one factor that would weigh in that decision. The process of getting to FAPE, and I am doing a huge disservice to your special education staff here because I have simplified this in a way that is misleadingly simple, but it's not this simple. I can assure you of that. The way it works, and I'm realizing that my font color is probably not ideal here. But the way it works is we start with something called present levels of education, meaning what are this child's present levels when it comes to reading, writing, math, cognitive ability, motor ability, speech ability, language ability. Those present levels of performance, what they tell us is how the student is performing, what the student's ability levels are in each of those areas. And it's from those present levels of performance that we determine whether there are educational needs that have to be addressed through either goals or services. So you see the first box is present levels. We have to ascertain the present levels. The way we ascertain those present levels is through those assessments that we just discussed. Those will tell us the child's unique circumstances. From there, we then determine, based on those present levels, what are the areas of educational need. Once we've identified the areas of educational need, then we either write goals where appropriate or accommodations where appropriate. There are certain things that are static that are not going to change, usually dealing with like cognitive ability, for example, where you serve certain cognitive abilities or cognitive processes with accommodations as opposed to goals, because you're born with certain ability levels. You're not going to be able to change certain things about you. From that information, again, we write goals. These goals have to be generally written for a 1-year period. They have to be measurable. They have to be properly ambitious. And they have to be tied to a standard, a content standard for the state. So these goals can address a variety of different things. For example, if we want to increase the reading rate of a student, we could write a goal for that. If the student is so far behind in their reading rate that we need to work on that. If it's a writing issue, we would write a goal there. If you've never seen an IEP, I would invite you to. You'll see how complicated these goals can be. You also have to include the baseline, which is where is the student starting at in this area that we're working on. And then where do we want them to be at the end of this year so that we can measure progress? Those goals, the combination of goals, accommodation, services are then taken together, and then we look at placement. And what we mean by placement is literally the physical location where this child is going to learn. And when we're looking at placement, we're looking to determine what is the least restrictive environment where this child can be taught and can make progress. And least restrictive environment refers to how much time are they spending away from their non-disabled peers? How much time are they spending with your general education students? Because the law recognizes that there is a benefit to that. There's a benefit to being educated with your non-disabled peers. And so you have to justify anytime you move to a more restrictive placement, you have to justify that move so that you're constantly within that placement that's the least restrictive environment where this child may be. And I'll show you what we call the continuum of placement options in a second. But there's a variety of different placements where we can place a student. Then we obviously look for additional supports and services that are necessary to ensure that the student has access. And that leads us to FAPE. That is FAPE, the ultimate offer of service of goals, services, accommodations, and placement, a combination of things that are memorialized in an IEP. That is your offer of FAPE. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is a continuum of placement options where we look to when we're deciding what's the least restrictive environment where we can educate the student. And, we always start with the least restrictive being in a general education class. If a student can make appropriate progress in a general education class, and then that's where the student should be placed. But some students are not able to, so then we look at what are called special day classes, which usually entail the students spending the vast majority of their day in a special education classroom with some time with their general education peers, like for lunchtime, extracurricular activities, assemblies. And usually special day classes are housed in what we call comprehensive campuses, meaning you have a campus like Huntington Middle School, where you have gen ed students and special education students, so there can be that interaction. When you move to what we call up there a non-public school, non-public schools are schools that have been certified by the California Department of Education to be able to work with students with disabilities. Those are special education schools generally. They are comprised almost always exclusively of special education students. So that is, once you start to get into that non-public school range, you're now really talking about the more restrictive environments, because there's going to be very little to no interaction with general education peers, since the students are in a different school that's primarily serving special education students. And then state special education schools are even more restrictive, and you work your way all the way through what we call a residential treatment center, where a student is living in a particular facility 24 hours a day, requiring 24-hour support, as well as instruction in the home is also considered a restrictive placement, because again, you're not around your general education peers or non-disabled peers. So got a little bit ahead of myself. So if I can contextualize all of this, right? We go through the assessment process, we identify those needs, we write goals, we determine services, accommodations. We then take all that information and we try to figure out where in this continuum of placements is the least restrictive environment where we can implement this IEP. And this is one area where there is almost always some level of, well, there may always be some level of disagreement, and it works both ways, where you have some parents that really want their child to be educated in general education, and you have other parents that believe that their child's disability warrants non-public school placement. So I think placement tends to be the biggest area of disagreement, but not always, but it could be. So it's really important for us when we're making this decision to really weigh all those factors and make the decision that's going to place the student in the least restrictive environment. Yes.
For the non-public school, so what is the criteria to decide whether they are capable to provide a service?
Whether or not they would be able to make progress on their IEP in any of the placements that precede non-public school placement. So if you have a student that is not able to make progress in the general education environment or in the special day class, and they have needs that require a higher level of support than what's offered, or a more structured program with a lot of embedded services, and then those are the students that you might consider to be candidates for non-public school placement. But they tend to be the students that simply can't.
Is there some kind of specialty? Those what kind of specialty they can?
There's
student.
There's a variety of different ones. There's some that focus more on behaviors, like students that exhibit a lot of behaviors. There's some non-public schools that are very good at helping students with behaviors. There are other non-public schools that are more about students that have mental health needs, and so they're more therapeutic in nature. There's also some non-public schools that work with students who have, I'm trying to frame this correctly here, have academic needs that warrant a higher level of support than what can be offered in the general education. These are students that need more individualized attention than can be provided in a general education class, even with like a one-on-one aid. They just require smaller classrooms. And so these non-public schools are able to offer these placements where there's only a handful of students at a time, and they can really hone in and serve that student's needs. Yes.
So what is the difference? You keep saying non-public versus private.
And that's a great question, and they get intertwined quite a bit. Non-public schools are private schools. The difference between them and your ordinary private school is that non-public schools have been certified by the California Department of Education to be able to serve students with disabilities. This means that they go through a process where they have to allow the CDE to come to their schools to really validate that the services that they're providing are appropriate for students with disabilities, so we can have some level of assurance that we're not just sending our student anywhere where they're just, kind of help along as opposed to really making progress. Any other questions? Okay. So parent rights, and again, this is one of those areas where we're looking just very, very generally. But the law does vest parents of students with disabilities with a variety of rights that they have. And the best place to kind of get a sense of what the universe of rights are is what we call the notice to parent, guardians, and surrogates of procedural safeguards. We call them parent rights. And this is a pamphlet that's put together by your special education local plan area, or your SELPA, which is SELPA are the hardest things to explain, but they're essentially a body that serves a variety of districts that generally serve an area of school districts, and they can provide anything from guidance and training to funding for certain mental health programs. They essentially help you administer at a much higher level what is happening within the boundaries of their school districts. And they help generate these procedural safeguards, and you can actually download a copy off of the West San Gabriel Valley SELPA, which is San Marino SELPA, of these parent rights, and they'll outline everything that essentially for parents to understand what are their rights and how to enforce those rights. So if you've never read it, it might serve you well to take a quick glance so you kind of get a good sense of what these things include. But I've summarized some of them, and I've kept this list to more of the kinds of things that you would be deciding when we're making decisions about settlement agreements and things like that, or when issues are brought to your attention about those matters, so that you kind of get a sense of why we do what we have to do sometimes at the school level.
Are they under LA County Education?
I'm sorry, say that again,
Are
apologies.
they under LA County Education?
The LA County Office of Education. So LACO is more, I would say LACO is probably, it's a distinct body. They work on completely separate things, but it would kind of be an umbrella even over them, if you will. Although I don't know that there's a whole lot of overlap between the two organizations. I think SELPAs are more about serving your special education departments within their area, whereas LACO is looking at a variety of different issues and how schools are run within LA County. So I'm going to just go through this list of different areas or different subjects of which a parent can make requests. And I'll emphasize this now, but I'll also emphasize it in one of these slides. I believe it's the second to last slide, that just because these requests can be made doesn't always necessarily mean that they can or should be granted. But I think it gives you a sense of what it is that we typically encounter in this arena. And that is, they have the right to request their students' records. They typically get them within 5 business days. They have the right to audio record IEP meetings as long as they give us 24-hour notice. They have the right to request evaluations of their child, both once they are eligible or before they are eligible. Parents can request an evaluation. Now, once their students are eligible, they are obviously protected by these procedural safeguards, but parents can request evaluations at any point. They can request IEP meetings, and we should be granting these requests within 30 days of receiving them, not counting breaks of more than 5 days. They can request changes to their child's IEPs, and this could be changes to the services that they're getting, not just the amounts of services, but even the types of services. They can request changes to their child's placement. Like as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the school team believes that the child's placement is a non-public school and the parent wants to keep them in general education or in in a comprehensive campus. So they can make that request even after it's been offered to place their child in a different school, or they can request changes to goals, anything relating to the identification, placement or provision of a FAPE to a child is something that a parent can request. And there is no specific limitation, and again, getting ahead of myself, as to the number of requests that they can make relating to this. Our obligation, again, doesn't necessarily require that we grant every request, although we have to consider and respond to every request. They can also request independent educational evaluations at public expense. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're not going to grant an IEE requested, more often than not, you're going to be required to file. I say more often than not because there are some very narrow exceptions to the district's obligation to file. But more often than not, you're going to be filing if a parent of a student makes a request for an IEE and you're not granting it. Parents can request reimbursement for services that they privately procure or placements that they privately fund for their child. Again, this is another area where what we're looking to in considering these requests is whether or not what we're offering is FAPE. Because if we get to hearing later, and a parent makes a request for reimbursement, we deny it, we go to hearing, and it turns out that the district's IEP was not providing a FAPE, then the parent may, if the services they privately procured were appropriate, and if they gave the district adequate notice in advance before going out and getting the services and then requesting reimbursement, then the district may be liable to reimburse the parents for those services. There's also the right to request that a school district fund a specific program. This goes back to that placement issue I mentioned earlier. Parents also have the right to consent to some, none, or all of the components of their child's IEP. They have the right to receive prior written notice in response to any proposed or refused actions relating to their child's identification, assessment, or educational placement, or the provision of a FAPE. They have the right to have an advocate or an attorney present at the IEP meeting for their child. And they also have the right to make a request for due process. A note on having an attorney or advocate present at an IEP meeting. Typically, if there is going to be an attorney present, we always recommend the district have their own attorney present as well. But that can happen, and sometimes tends to happen in some of our more high-profile cases where we have these attorneys coming in and representing families, and that's well within their right to do. As I alluded to earlier, with some exceptions, there's no specific limitation on the number of requests a parent can make, and I'm emphasizing make here, right? You have the right to make the request. Whether or not that request is granted is a completely separate issue. What we do have to do is we do have to respond to those requests. And to be clear, you have the parents have the right to make these requests prior to, during, or after an IEP meeting. One thing to note is just because a request was previously granted doesn't mean that the parent can't come back, a year later and request it again, that, they don't have a one-time use it or lose it sort of thing. It really means we have to respond to that request each time we get it. Based on our experience, parents can and often do make the same requests year after year. We must obviously consider those requests each time they come. Just because we responded to that request a year ago doesn't mean that we're absolved from having to respond to it a year later if it's a renewed request. And again, just because a request was previously granted, it doesn't mean that it will be granted again, although sometimes we do grant requests. One very important thing that you should bear in mind is that just because a parent is making a request or because the district is granting a request, it does not mean that somebody did something wrong. There's quite a few considerations that go into these decisions, some of which have absolutely nothing to do with whether what was right or wrong was done. Obviously, we take into account whether or not what's already been offered is a FAPE. And if it's not FAPE, then that we may be inclined to either grant those requests or explore ways to ensure that our programming is FAPE. But coming back to my main point here is it doesn't always mean just because a parent request doesn't mean somebody did something wrong. There's just a parent exercising their right, and the district can then exercise their right to respond to that request as it sees appropriate. So that was in a nutshell, the kinds of typical requests that we see in the parents' right to make them. I want to get into the due process procedures and the related considerations. As I mentioned earlier, parents do have the right to file for due process. Their filing has to relate. It has to be about the identification of the child, meaning either they are eligible or they're not eligible. And if they are eligible, it has to deal with the eligibility category that they're making. It has to be about an evaluation, meaning our assessments that we conducted. It has to be about the appropriateness of their placement or the provision of a FAPE, meaning all the other things that we talked about that go into a FAPE, like the goals, the services, the accommodations. It has to be about that. It cannot be about things that are, for example, a discrimination claim that is not premised on a violation of the IDA, that they're not saying you discriminated against my child. And that resulted in a denial of FAPE. You just discriminated against my child. That in and of itself is not a claim that would come before OAH, unless they can say that discrimination caused a denial of FAPE. And even then, there is some debate about what is within the jurisdiction of the Office of Administrative Hearings to decide, because their jurisdiction is just limited to cases about those factors that I've listed here. There's a 2-year statute of limitations on these cases, meaning when a parent files, they can go back 2 years. But there are some exceptions. Typically, these include in situations where information has been withheld from the family such that they cannot be apprised of a potential need for them to file, or the existence of a claim, and other factors that go into decisions that may open the statute of limitations for more than 2 years. But most cases are limited to 2 years. I think there's very few cases that we see where somebody's trying to go back more than 2 years. And then the Office of Administrative Hearings, and I keep talking about them, and I promise you I have a slide that's going to tell you who they are and what they do. They must develop forms for parents who are self-represented to be able to fill out these forms and be able to file their own due process complaints if they so desire. So, what are some of the reasons that, oh, did I get ahead of myself? Oh, I didn't. Okay. What are some of the reasons that a school district may file? Well, like I mentioned earlier, you might file to defend an evaluation when an IEE is requested. You may also file to override a parent's refusal to consent to an assessment or a reassessment, meaning you want the Office of Administrative Hearings to give you an order that says you can assess this child if this parent wants special education for their child, regardless of whether the parent signs in consent to the assessment or not. Then there's also the ability to file whenever a parent refuses to consent to an IEP, except you cannot file if a parent refuses to consent to an initial IEP, like the very first time their child is being found eligible. If they decide they don't want special education, they don't want to consent to that initial, then there's no right to file. But once a child's been found eligible, you meet every year to revise that IEP, and changes to that IEP require parental consent. So like, for example, let's say you have a student that has an IEP that's coming to an end today. And we did an assessment. This child was previously receiving specialized academic instruction, so special education, and occupational therapy services. So we're meeting to review this annual IEP. And in conjunction with that, we conduct the speech and language assessment, and we determine now that the student needs speech and language services. We would, at that new annual, potentially add that service into the IEP. And before we can start providing the services that we come up with at the new annual, we need the parent to consent to that IEP. And so sometimes parents don't consent, or sometimes parents consent to certain things in the IEP and not others. And so those may be instances where the district may have to file. California is very unique in the sense that if you have an IEP where a parent consents to certain components of an IEP, but not others, there's arguably an obligation to file to override the parent's lack of consent to those portions that were not consented to. So the burden is literally placed on the districts under some circumstances to file, which is very unique to California. I think most other states, if a parent doesn't consent, then we just provide the services that they consented to. But in California, we have that additional obligation to file. And the idea being, or the decision to place that obligation on the district is based on the idea that we're doing what's in the best interest of the child. And sometimes that warrants having to file to get that child the services they might need, especially when you have a situation where a child desperately needs a service. We know they need it and we're just not getting that consent. We may have to file in those instances where we might otherwise not want to. What are some of the reasons that parents might file? Well, as I mentioned earlier, they might disagree with the goals, they might disagree with the services, they might disagree with the placement. And if that's the case, and if through the IEP process, we cannot resolve those disagreements, that may lead a parent to file against the school district. They may also file against the school district because they believe that their child has lost an educational benefit and they're entitled to compensatory education. We saw that a lot during the COVID closures, where parents felt like the services that their child were getting remotely was not adequately serving their child. And so they felt like their child had some educational benefit loss that they needed to be compensated through compensatory services. And so they would file for due process. They can also file for due process to obtain reimbursement for services that they privately paid for and are now seeking for the school district to pay. And then finally, to enforce protections afforded to special education students who face disciplinary action. Students who are eligible for special education have certain procedural protections when it comes to discipline. There are certain things that need to happen before a student with special needs can be expelled. For example, we have to have something called a manifestation determination meeting, where the team looks just at the facts of the allegations against the student for which the student is being recommended for expulsion, and they have to determine whether the behaviors exhibited by the student in that incident are a manifestation of their disability. And you really read that really liberally, where one example was a case from the Office of Administrative Hearings where a student was caught selling drugs on campus. Student was eligible for special education for ADHD. And the school district in that case, I believe they reached the decision that there was no connection between the ADHD and the selling of the drugs. And when this wasn't a case we tried, but when the case got to hearing, the Office of Administrative Hearings found that, in fact, it was a manifestation of the child's disability, because you're supposed to read their disability very broadly, and students with ADHD can be impulsive, and the selling of the drugs could be a manifestation of that impulsive nature of ADHD. So whenever there's a decision that goes against the student, you have a manifestation determination meeting, you make that determination that wasn't a manifestation, then parents can file. And in those instances, those cases move extremely fast. And I should kind of give you some context. Traditionally, once a case is filed for due process, you get a hearing date within 40 days, but parties tend to move that timeline and expand it so they can mediate and give themselves some time. But more often than not, you're in hearing by the 5th month if you're going to go to hearing. With these disciplinary cases, where the issue is whether or not a student should be expelled, you're in hearing within, I want to say within 20 days. I mean, you get a mediation within 10 to 15 days, and you're in hearing a week later. So they move incredibly fast. And the idea is we've got to protect this before the student sustains a harm that cannot be repaired by being expelled.
So it takes 20 days to go to hearing on a matter relating to expulsion.
Correct.
What's happening with the student in the interim? Is the student at home during that 20 days, or is the student still in school? Because typically you're not moving to expel unless it's a very serious offense. And so we've been in this situation before, and the student was not continuing to come to school during that period of time.
There's a variety of ways to address that. One of them could be like an interim placement if there's agreement between the parties. But the idea of that 10-day mediation is to try to resolve
it as quickly as possible. So let me ask you this also. You're talking about expulsion, but what about other forms of discipline such as suspension?
That could result in the need for a manifestation determination meeting if this is going to be I'm going to try to abbreviate it, but it's rather a complicated explanation. But if the student within the course of a school year has been suspended for 10 days, and this suspension is going to put them over 10 days, so to 11 days, then yes, So long as those other suspensions, the incidents giving rise to them are somewhat similar, for lack of, and then I'm really not using the correct terminology so I can illustrate the point, but they have to be somewhat related. The behaviors have to be somewhat similar, or the issues have to be related for you to say that all of these suspensions can be put together. But if you've had a suspension, you have a student that has already been suspended 10 days and you're going to the 11th day, you have to have a manifestation determination meeting.
Okay, so the trigger is the 10-day period of time.
10-day period.
So you could suspend a student with a disability for 1 or 2 days throughout the year and not have to do a manifestation determination.
That's correct.
Okay,
That's correct.
thank you.
So those are some of the reasons why a parent may file. The remedies that families can obtain, and I think the remedies that a school district can obtain are pretty self-evident. Like I said, if you're requesting the ability to assess a child without parent consent, then what you're going to get is the right to assess. Or if you're filing as a school district on the right to implement an IEP without parent consent, then that's the remedy you're going to get. But for families, the remedies may look a little different. If they prevail, if they're deemed the prevailing party over a particular issue, then they can get anywhere from reimbursement for private placement that they've paid for, or private services that they obtained, including transportation costs. Again, if they can show that the district's offer of FAPE was not appropriate, that it denied a FAPE, and that the placement or services that they are funding were appropriate. And that standard can be a little murky, but effectively you have to show that it was an appropriate service. They can also get compensatory education in the form of a bank of hours through a non-public agency, who will then provide services to that student for a finite amount of services ordered by the Office of Administrative Hearing. That student can then access over the course of 2 years or more, depending on what the decision says. Sometimes when the issue is what's in the IEP, OAH may also order the district to convene an IEP meeting to make some changes to that IEP, or they may just order a change in directly based on the evidence that they've been offered at hearing. There's also the ability by families to receive an award of reasonable attorney's fees if they are deemed the prevailing party. This is a secondary process. The attorney's fees cannot be awarded by the Office of Administrative Hearings. Typically, that entails separate litigation in federal court. And so if a family goes to hearing and they show that they had a high degree of success obtaining the remedies that they've shown, then they may obtain an attorney's fees award. And in the context of special education, I don't think I'm saying anything inappropriate here when I say, when you're looking at your big picture of what might happen at the end of a hearing, those attorney's fees can be a significant factor, or can be a significant share of that liability. It isn't uncommon, for example, to see a situation where a student gets a bank of hours that's worth maybe $15,000, $20,000, but the attorney's fees at the end of that hearing might exceed $150,000. And so we have to obviously take that into account when we are discussing cases. One tool that we have in our toolbox to address that is the opportunity to send something called a statutory offer of settlement, which is an offer that tells the family, you have 10 days to accept this offer. This is what we're willing to do. And what that offer does is, if you go to hearing and the family is successful and obtains an award that is less than what you've offered in your statutory offer letter, then their attorney's fees are I'm going to really simplify this, they're stopped as of the day that you send a statutory offer. So you're not going to likely be found responsible for fees that accrue after the statutory offer. If you go to hearing, you made a statutory offer and they beat your statutory offer, then you're maybe on the hook for all of their attorney's fees. So we try when possible to make statutory offer settlements as a way to mitigate the risk. Yes.
So does the statutory offer reset your 2-year statute of limitation?
No, that only has to do with whether or not the case is going to settle. If they accept your offer and you reach an agreement, agreements will typically include something called a waiver of claims, and it usually will be to the date of signature of the agreement. meaning from the date that they signed and going back however long you want, those claims are waived. And so it restarts the clock, if you will. Mhm. But it takes them accepting that the mere issuance of one is not enough. So I've been talking a lot about the Office of Administrative Hearings, and I've not yet told you who they are. So the Office of Administrative Hearings is a state agency. They operate under the auspices of the California Department of General Services. I give you a little snippet of the way the Office of Administrative Hearings describes itself. But they employ the administrative law judges who decide these cases in the first instance. In the state of California, we have generally two divisions, although now that everything is online, there's really no blurriness between those divisions. We have a northern division and we have a southern division. And each of those divisions handles the cases that come from those respective areas. Administrative law judges. Currently, I think most all of them have been doing this for a little while now. But you don't necessarily have to have a special education background to be an administrative law judge. I mean, people apply for these jobs, typically lawyers. Actually, lawyers, I believe lawyers are the only people who can apply for these jobs. And they are employed to both mediate cases and to hear these cases and issue opinions about them. The way this process works is it starts with the filing of the complaint with the Office of Administrative Hearings. We then have to respond within 10 days of receiving the due process complaint. The district then is required to invite a family to something called a resolution session, which is a less formal meeting to discuss the issues in the case and see if there is any room for a resolution. But that resolution session can be waived by both parties. And oftentimes what parties do is they waive the resolution session and go directly into mediation. If you do, in fact, and you don't have to necessarily waive, you can have a resolution session and you can have mediation, but I'm just telling you what tends to happen more often than not in practice. If you choose to participate in mediation, the mediation is administered by the Office of Administrative Hearings. So administrative law judges serve as the mediators in these cases. And so the parties meet in mediation and the judge tries to facilitate a resolution of the parties' dispute. If you don't come to an agreement at resolution session or at mediation or after mediation, then you proceed to an administrative hearing. An administrative hearing is a less formal version of a trial, where the parties we used to meet in person, and more often than not, it would happen in rooms like this one, like a boardroom, where we could set it up to look like a courtroom, and parties will call witnesses will come and testify, parties will introduce evidence, and then at the end of all that, a decision is rendered. Now they're being heard virtually. That started after COVID, and it's kind of remained in place. And so parties log in and participate in these due process hearings virtually. They can take anywhere from a day, but there's very few cases nowadays that only take a day. I think more often than not, you're going to be there for a handful of days, 4, 5, 6, sometimes more days of being in hearing from 9:30 to 4 in the afternoon or longer if the judge wishes to stay longer. And then at the end of all that, a decision is rendered and you have the option to the party who's not the prevailing party, or even the prevailing party sometimes do appeal decisions if they don't get everything that they requested. You can appeal that decision to a court, and then there's the appellate process that plays out after that. And that process can go all the way up to the Supreme Court, for example. We've talked about Andrew F. That's a case that started in an administrative hearing and worked its way all the way up to Supreme Court. Or, you might just get one round of appeal, especially if it seems like it's a stronger case for the party that prevailed in the due process hearing. Now, Congress recognizes that the importance of fostering resolutions of disputes. And I think there is a heavy push towards finding common ground for claims and trying to resolve them without having to go to due process. And so The way this works is you try to resolve them at the IEP level first. If it's something that can be resolved at the IEP level, you try to work collaboratively with the family. These meetings are supposed to be collaborative. They're not supposed to be adversarial. And so we use the IEP process to try to work with the family to address their concerns and try to resolve things before they get to a point where somebody's filing for due process. There's also opportunities to do informal resolution sessions before somebody files where the parties come together and they try to resolve, or you can resort to alternative dispute resolution where you bring in a third party. Again, this is before anyone has filed anything to try to help the parties reach a resolution. And more, I'm seeing a lot of these pre-filing efforts to try to reach an agreement on things. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of the things that sometimes is lost in all of this is the fact that the family and the school district are going to have to work together. You know, when you have a student that's in first grade or kindergarten and they might be your student until age 22, you want to preserve that relationship. You want to have a working collaborative relationship where possible. So sometimes that entails reaching resolutions early on and showing the family and the family showing the district a willingness to work with each other and to try to address problems before they become a bigger deal. But if that doesn't work and there is a filing, that doesn't mean we're done discussing settlement. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to have to convene a resolution session anyway. So that's an opportunity to have a conversation as well as a mediation that would be facilitated by the Office of Administrative Hearings. But there is a big push from the Office of Administrative Hearings to really encourage parties to try to find a resolution. And you'll see in a second when I show you the statistics, you'll see that the overwhelming majority of cases resolve. So, and here's that slide. So the vast majority of cases settle. Data published for the 21-22 school year showed that the Office of Administrative Hearings closed 4,412 cases that year. Of those cases, only 82 cases went to hearing. So you've got 4,400 cases, only 82 go to hearing. That gives you a little less than 2% of these cases going to hearing and actually reaching a decision following the hearing. You know, so by contrast, 3,700 or so of those cases settled. The remaining cases are cases that get dismissed or get withdrawn because the parties likely settled, but they're not reported to OAH as having been settled. But I'm willing to bet that a good chunk of those remaining 500 cases or so are probably resolved without it being reported to OAH, or they were withdrawn. You know, we see that as well fairly often, that cases get pulled. And so here are the statistics that I alluded to. This is directly from OAH's website and shows you the breakdown, and you'll see that the vast majority of cases are kind of clustered around parties settling fully at mediation. There's 401 of those cases. Parties settling during resolution sessions, there's 68 of those cases. And then parties settling at some point in the due process timeline, there's 3,229 of those cases. So chances are that if you get a due process filing, it's more likely than not to settle than to actually go to hearing. That's not to say that that's what needs to happen in every case, but that's just the reality of the way things have been going. And I think that statistics, if you do the math for every year that OAH has been tasked with deciding these cases, I think you'd find that it goes anywhere from 2 to 4% of cases that go to hearing. So it's a really small fraction of those cases that actually make it. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is in a second, as in now. When we're deciding settlement, you know, I think the guiding principle is always what's in the student's best interest. Obviously, the merits of a case have a lot to do with that as well. But we're always employing a child-centered approach, because as a school district, it's your obligation to serve and educate these children. And so doing what's in their best interest sometimes entails settling a case, or sometimes it also entails not settling a case. If the ask is something that we just don't think it's in the best interest of the child, then that may be a reason why you wouldn't settle the case. But that is certainly a big factor. As I mentioned earlier, these are families you're going to be working with for a long time, and your staff is going to come into contact at least once a year, we know from the IEP process, but more often than not, way more often than that. So settlement could also be used as a way to promote future and continued collaboration between the parties as a way of kind of show good faith that we will be working closely with our families. And there are other practical considerations that go into these decisions that are unique to every case. But again, the best interest of the child, the merits of the claim, and the promoting of future and continued collaboration are definitely heavy factors in these decisions. But obviously, not every case settles. So as I mentioned earlier, if a case has to go to hearing, the hearing is usually held virtually. The length depends on the number of issues being decided, the number of witnesses being called. Because the school district is the entity serving the child, it tends to be the case that school district staff are represent the largest percentage of people who actually testify in the hearing. So if you were to look at a witness list for a hearing, you'd find that the larger share of witnesses come from the district. And so that also means that we have to pull these individuals from a classroom to be able to come and teach, or pull them from having to serve other children to be able to come in and testify. So that's another factor that we consider in making decisions. And at the end of a hearing, the parties can choose to make an oral closing statement, or they can choose to write a closing brief and submit that to the Office of Administrative Hearings. The Office of Administrative Hearings then takes all this information and they publish a written decision that is circulated to the parties. That decision will lay out what the judge believes are the facts, what the judge believes to be true, because sometimes you may have disputes about events. The district may have one version of events, the family may have a different, so they'll settle those disputes as to who did what. They'll provide their legal conclusions to determine whether or not there's been a violation of the law. And then they'll determine who the prevailing parties are, meaning who prevailed on a particular issue, and then what remedies, if any, they're entitled to. You can read these decisions. They're available online to the public off of OAH's website. They're also circulated to anybody who signs up to receive them in an email. So they're definitely out there for public consumption. If after a hearing, you determine that the outcome wasn't something that you believe was warranted the decision, or if you want to appeal and you go through the appellate process, these cases can be in an appeal state for a long time. I think I was just with a judge this morning who was mentioning that is reading a case that just ended its appellate cycle from 2017. So 6 years later, that case is still going in the appellate court. So that can really draw out the process. During the pendency of a case, while a case is being decided and while appeals are being decided, the student is entitled to something called stay put, which is the status quo, the placement and services that they were last getting, that were last consented to and implemented, so that while this legal process is playing out, they're not being deprived of their educational benefit. And so that would be stay put. So that can also serve if, for example, the district proposes a change of placement and the family is not ready to make that change. Stay put could be a way for the family to keep their child in that placement until however number of years is necessary to get through the end of the appellate life. So those are all the points I wanted to make with you this afternoon. Does anyone have any questions for me?
If you could go back to your slide that has the progression of the placement of the students, whether it's special day class or.
The continuum of placement options?
Yes.
Here we go.
So as you're on this slide,
Mhm.
There's an on-ramp, right? And a child is found to be needing the services. I'm not seeing a progression of areas where students have met some of the criteria and can go into, instead of an IEP, perhaps an SST 504. Where are the areas in which we can look at in terms of servicing our students and not have this progression, because you only show a one-sided progression?
And I didn't mean to mislead in that manner. That is not a progression chart. That what that is it shows you the progression from what we consider the least restrictive environment to the most restrictive environment. that was not meant to show you what may happen to a student where they may start in gen ed and they may end up in RTC. Some students do, but an overwhelming amount of students make progress in their placements and remain their placements. There's a significant number of students that also get to a point where they're able to access the curriculum without an IEP, and they may step down to a 504 plan or an SST. So that's certainly something that happens, but that continuum of placement options, that's just meant to show you what the least restrictive placement looks like and what the most restrictive placement looks like. But you're absolutely right. If a student is ready to be exited from special education, that is an option. And that is also a reason why sometimes a school district may file if a school district determines that a student has made progress and warrants exiting from special education, and the family is not yet ready to make that decision. It may require the parties to resolve that through a hearing. But yes, it works the other way too.
Thank you.
All right.
I do have a question
Mhm.
about the on-ramp that Shelley mentioned. I feel like from personal experience, the on-ramp is very challenging to access. So are we making it a clear pathway for our parents who they feel that there is some, like say in kindergarten,
Mhm.
where the teacher doesn't even know the child and the parent wants them evaluated? Where does the parent go to start that process?
It's something as simple as submitting a written request to the teacher or to the director of special education or to the district. It's not meant to be a very complicated process. They can literally just write it in a piece of paper and give it to the teacher, and that would trigger.
And that's the same as like asking for an IEP.
That's
Yeah.
correct. Mhm.
Do they
Yeah.
have to say, I want an IEP?
Not necessarily, not in those, there's no magic words. I think
Yeah.
what it takes is just a clear indication of the need for special education.
I just wanted to jump in and add to that. So there is a process at each school site, which usually starts off with an SST meeting, which is a function of general education. So the teacher, the parent, the student, the principal, the counselor will all meet and kind of first talk about which sort of like tier 1 interventions can be exhausted before we jump to special education, because we want to make sure that we exhaust all the interventions or all the resources that we have available to that student before we get to special education. It's not that we don't want to provide an IEP, but we just want to make sure that whatever issues the child may be having could be resolved with just, a regular intervention before we get to an assessment. Of course, there are cases that we jump to an assessment right away, but it's all individualized. So I just wanted to share that process.
Thank you.
I think that's a great point, that we definitely have other procedures in place that will capture those students that maybe the parents don't know how to ask. That will capture those students and make sure that we are assessing them, including the SST process when a student is struggling.
And do the assessments themselves ever, deny the access to FAPE if you're pulling kids for lots of tests that have nothing to do with their actual curriculum?
We mitigate the amount of time that they're spending away. Sometimes assessments can be broken where you can, there's every test has its own instructions, what you can and cannot do and how long it's going to take. But where we can, we make every effort to not disrupt the student's instruction. But some assessments can be lengthy, although I think that more often than not, they get broken down so that you're only out of the classroom for a short period of time to do one assessment. And then if it's necessary to bring you back later, we do that. It doesn't always take you away for days. It certainly doesn't take you away for days, but it certainly doesn't also take you away for a long period of time. Okay.
Questions? Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Mr.
much.
Salazar.
Thank you so much for your time. Excuse me.
Pass it all the way down to Francesca.
She gets both of these. All of them.
All of it. She
Sorry,
gets all of that.
all of those.
And Jane gets all of that.
Ooh. All right, 4B, this is budget overview, and I'd like to turn the floor to Dr. Michael Lynn, who will lead the board in a budget overview.
Thank you, President Bryan, members of the Board of Education, Superintendent Dr. Delatorre, and the executive team. I have the privilege of presenting the budget study session this afternoon's special board meeting. Next slide, please, Steve.
Jane, it's just you and me. This is coming back, right?
So did we just lose the board?
Go ahead.
All right, so this is recorded and families at home are also watching. We have principals here in the audience as well as a community liaison. So the role of the board in the budget study session and in the budget planning process in general is the collective board establishes the budget priorities, adopts the budget, and monitors, adjusts the district finances. The Board of Education has a very special relationship with the superintendent in that the superintendent is the only employee of the Board of Education. The Board of Education establishes priorities in the form of BPs, board policies, and defines the what's. The superintendent handles the procedures, the administrative regulations in relation to the board policies, and handles the implementation of the hows. Now, the governor made the January budget proposal for the next fiscal year, and the most salient part is the 8.13% cost of living adjustment. Cost of living, you're going to see that in the acronym of COLA. Unfortunately, there's no mention in the governor's proposal for any pension relief, which we're looking at 20%, 27% for classified employees, 19.1% for certificated employees next year. I have a subsequent slide that provides more details about our pension obligations and how this 8.13% factors into next year. Next slide, please. And this is the budget calendar. This is a timeline that starts with the start of the fiscal year on July 1st and ends on June 30th. So basically, July 1st is when the budget is due to the county. We have to adopt it at the local LEA level, local educational level before July 1st. By October 15th, we have the unaudited actuals. It's a report due to the board and then certified at the county level. The first interim report data was captured on October 31st and delivered to the county by December 15th. We just recently had the governor's January proposal. We're doing the March 7th budget study session right now. That's the bullet near the middle. And then March 15th is the second interim report. We're going to have a presentation to the Board of Education on March 14th in our regularly scheduled board meeting. And then in May, we await the governor's May revise, and that's going to inform the statutory COLA that will factor into the budget adoption process for the following year. Okay, next slide, Stephen. School finance basics. Basically, for most school districts in California, the bulk of school funding comes from the state as authorized by Proposition 98, which provides the minimum funding guarantee for schools. The distribution mechanism for Prop 98 is called the Local Control Funding Formula, or LCFF. Over the last few years, LCFF has a growing list of compliance and reporting requirements. Next slide, please. So as we see here, here's a visual representation of our general fund revenues with the bulk of the funding coming from the state. This is 68% for San Marino Unified School District. And this is true for other districts too, just that their blue slice is much bigger than ours. You're going to see that the three green slices here in this pie chart are local revenues. They're coming from the foundation, which accounts for 4%, parcel taxes bring in 12%, and other local funds constituting another 10%. Looking at this, you see lottery is a little bit more than 1%, and federal revenues adding just 5% to our entire revenue stream. School districts with high unduplicated counts of English learners, students from low-income families and foster youth bring in much higher amounts in the form of Title I funds, Title II title funds in terms of federal funds, as well as state supplemental and concentration funds. for districts that have high unduplicated counts. We don't have that many. Ours is a little bit over 16%, and I'm going to show that later in the NYP presentation. Interim reports. Next slide, please. So the district produces 2 interim reports each fiscal year in accordance to statutory requirements and timelines. The first interim is due to the county on December 15th, and the second interim is due to the county on March 15th. Again, in our next board meeting on March 14th, staff will present the second interim report with data captured on the last day of January, by the last day of January. So that's a snapshot report. Each interim report must include a certification of whether or not we're able to meet our financial obligations. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of how we meet our financial obligations, there are 3 classifications of certifications. A positive certification is when we're able to meet our financial obligations for the current year and 2 subsequent fiscal years. A qualified certification is when a district may not be able to meet their financial obligations. And a negative certification is when they will not be able to meet their financial obligations for the current year and 2 subsequent years. For our district, due to the wisdom of our board and leadership from our superintendent, we will be able to meet our financial obligations this year and 2 subsequent years. And that's not going to be a problem for us. Okay, next slide, please. So our multi-year projections, this is really the core of this presentation. When we look at fiscal certifications, the law requires that we have the current year budget and the projections for 2 subsequent years. The MYP, or the multi-year projections, is a very important document shared with the County Office of Education, with the school board, among administrators, with our bargaining units. And it helps us in the planning and decision-making process. So if there's anything you take away from this presentation, I would say it's this, because I'm going to do another presentation for the second interim in a few days, actually next week on the 14th for the second interim report. So this data that you're seeing today is from the first interim, data captured up till October 31st. So before we dive into the most recent first interim MYP, I would like to stipulate that the numbers in the MYP do not represent cash. So it's not cash in the bank. The multi-year projection document is a budget projection. That's why they call it, the P in the MYP. It's a projection. So it's a budget projection built on assumptions, information from the governor in the form of COLA, as well as the dartboard information and fiscal data that we have available. So I'm going to pass out this the MYP printouts to here, and then here, and I have one for the audience if anybody wants to. So Dr. Choi, if you could do me a favor, if you could click on the link on the bottom, the rightmost bottom link, yes. So this is a compilation of all the interim financial reports we have posted on our website. If we go to the very first line on the right side where it says attachments, click here. So this is available to the public. Okay, so we could zoom in to the first page. And I'm gonna go through this because this is, I would say, one of the most important documents we have. It looks at the projections and helps us in the decision-making process when we do budgets. So the copy you have is somewhat highlighted because that's where I want to focus our attention to. Otherwise, we're going to spend, a good 5 hours on this, if not more. So the projected total ADA, you're going to see on the, you're going to see multiple columns, right? The one that's highlighted is for this year. That is the current year budget. And then to the right of that are 2 additional years because it's a multi-year projection. So we're going to look at this year's budget. The projected ADA, or the average daily attendance, is a decimal. It's not a whole number because attendance is a percentage of enrollment. And we get funded based on ADA, or average daily attendance. It is 2,683.33. Now, if we look down further, we have total CBEDS enrollment projection. CBEDS is the California Basic Educational Data System. It is the data that we capture on the first Wednesday in October when we determine what the enrollment is at that time. Any student that is enrolled after that will count towards the enrollment for the following year, but not for that fiscal year. We don't get funded based on enrollment, but we get funded as a percentage of enrollment through the ADA or the average daily attendance. And now our enrollment there is 2,752. Okay. And then we look down further, unduplicated numbers. These are the English learners, free reduced foster youth count. Now, free reduced is kind of locked in because every student gets free lunch and free breakfast right now. We have 448 identified students who are unduplicated. That accounts for 16.28% of our students who are unduplicated. Very low in numbers compared to other districts, and we get very little amount in terms of supplemental. We get zero amount in concentration grant dollars. Okay, so the total funded ADA projection is 2,768.3. Now, how is that ADA higher than the enrollment count? It's because we're taking advantage of the state's offer to do a 3-year average of ADA. This actually brings in more money for our district and it benefits our district this year. Okay, so further down, the target base grant is 27,508. So $27 million is our target base grant from the state. Okay, we get some grade span adjustment dollars too for the lower grade levels, TK through 3, as well as grades 9 through 12. That accounts for over $1 million that we bring in addition to the base grant. Okay, and this year there's a special bonus. We get a TK add-on in the amount of $115,000 that we quickly spent on personnel as well as supplies, instructional supplies for our TK. And then we have the targeted supplemental grant. This is the 16% of unduplicated count students. And we have, we're bringing in $931,000 for those students who are unduplicated. Okay, next page. So we're on page 2 now. Page 2, the total LCFF funding, local control funding formula, we are getting $29 million, $29.7 million. Now, how is that broken into property taxes and state aid? So if we look at this, you're going to see that $17 million of this $29.7 million comes from local property taxes. So the question of can we be basic aid, right? Like Beverly Hills? We can, but we're going to lose a lot of money. We're going to lose $11 million right there, right? 11 million of our $29 million, come from state additional funds, okay? So you're going to see $29.7 million, 10.6 is state aid. If we're basic aid, we don't get that state aid. Okay, so we cannot be a basic aid school district. So these few lines answer that question. If you get, if anybody were to ask, show them this NYP. Okay. So next we look at the supplemental grant. Again, it's 931,000. That was covered before because it came in due to the 16%.
How do you calculate property tax?
Property tax is automatically collected by the county for us. It's based on, so we have properties, parcels in trusts that are purchased many years ago with Prop 13 taxation that's locked in.
So it's the assessed value.
It's the assessed value that's locked in to the time when that property was purchased.
But if someday the city of San Marino, the resident is say very more open, so then so how often you update for the data?
Yeah, so we do a lot of research in the summer, especially because it ties to the next part, which is the measures R and E. It also connects to that. Yeah.
Can I respond to that? A couple of years ago, we did an analysis through KeyGen that said we're not anywhere close to being able to, we're very much behind because so many of the homes in San Marino are held in trust and were last assessed in the 70s or, early 80s. And they're handed down from generation to generation. So you have houses that could sell for 12 million in today's market. They're on the books for 200,000.
I knew the last time we talked about this issue is before COVID-19, but after COVID-19, I think several residents they pass away. Their Asian resident So I don't know if
Yeah.
they have.
Even
So-
if they pass away, though, the home still could be passed down to younger generations and not necessarily sold. So it's when the houses turn over and they're sold for market value, that's when we start to see the numbers going up.
Right.
So we're not anywhere close to that being a solution for us right now, but we are keeping an eye on that and continuously talking with our financial advisors about when those numbers will pencil out, but we're not anywhere close to that right now.
And Board Member Chen, you're absolutely right. It's when the transaction happens is when the property is reassessed to market value. So if that transaction doesn't happen, then we are only getting that amount in terms of property taxes. Yep. Okay, so we are at, let's see, projected federal income. So federal income now, you're gonna see that the center block right there, you see unrestricted, special education, restricted, and proposed budget. Okay, so those are the 4 different columns for each of the 3 years. And then you're gonna see for federal, we get some special education funding in the amount of $545,000. Okay, and then federal funds, we have ESSER funds. We still have $1.3 million in ESSER. Those are all restricted. Federal dollars are restricted. Okay, we cannot use it for any other purpose, but for those restricted purposes. Further down, we have other state revenues. Lottery has been asked a lot. People are like, oh yeah, you know, we should get a lot of money from lottery. A little bit more than 1% this year. And lottery comes in 2 flavors, right? No, I shouldn't say that. Comes in 2 parts, not 2 flavors, 2 parts. One is it's unrestricted, which, you see $437,000 of unrestricted. So sites could use their lottery funds for unrestricted purposes. We also have restricted. That's for only textbooks, instructional materials. We cannot use it on anything else. Okay, so that lottery brings in $614,000. Okay, further down, we see ELOP, the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, a state-funded program. Dr. Richter has partnered with the Right at School partners to implement this new requirement because we're required to receive this fund and required to implement the program. Okay, next page. Page 3 now. If we look at the highlighted side to the left, you see special education funds in a total amount of almost $3.2 million, right? So this is AB 602, state funding for special education. And then we have measures E and R. Measure E brings in $4.2 million a year. Measure R brings in $1.66 million a year. They increase not according to cost of living or CPI, consumer price index, but they increase 3% a year. Okay, so in fact, we're getting less and less because if the inflation is higher than that, we get less each year in terms of the actual real dollars. Okay. And then we're looking at the facility use income. We put in $350,000 because that's about the average we get each year. It's not much, it's $1/3 million. Chinese school bringing in the most, contributing the most, $136,000. And then further down, you see parent donations. So this is the part where we kind of differentiate ourselves from other school districts. Parent donations, if you look at this, InfoSnap brings in $365,000 a year. That's just unheard of, in any district. The amount that our parents and volunteers put in. ASB, we have the funds there at the sites, the students manage, as well as the PTAs and the PTSA. They bring in a total, if you add it up, is $888,000. And it's that 300,000 hours of volunteer work that put in all that work. And these are our phenomenal volunteers. So we have a lot that we want to say to thank and appreciate their contributions. Okay, so yes.
Go back to the major E and R. So have you checked because it's trying to promote the resident to vote. So then I think those senior citizens, they file the exemption. So how much is the difference? We are short of.
So we honor anytime, they provide the proof.
No, I mean the totally, the whole year, because of the exemption. Or then The
gap in revenue.
The goal is supposed to collect or the,
Yeah.
so the exemption is.
Yeah, it's off the top of my head, I don't have that number,
Yeah,
but
maybe
yeah,
you
it's
can
not that much.
check it later.
Yeah. We do get like, twice a month, somebody would turn in an application and then it's not that much. It's not a large percentage.
And they no longer have to submit annually. So once they submit, it goes on for the life of them living in that home.
Right.
Yeah.
So what we do also is we look at the local newspaper postings, obituaries. It is a lot of research work in the summer. And that's when things, we calm down. We really focus on the parcel taxes. And so that's one of the projects we work on this summer. Okay, so we have that. And then the donations, if you look at the donations on the bottom of page 3, you're going to see the COP debt services. So we had the remaining contribution, the donation happened in 21-22. And this year we're going to handle that at the district level. This is for the Boff Athletic Center donation.
Yeah.
And then the City of San Marino Grant Proposition A. I know this is something that the city is considering. I've been working with my city counterpart over there, the fiscal person. The city has been very generous, helping us with the reimbursements up to $110,000 a year in transportation costs for the high school. We're looking at hopefully increasing that a little bit next year.
50.
And once that's finalized and approved by the council, then we could put it in the budget as well.
Yeah, this is the issue, I think last Saturday in the robotic. So they are talking about because the kid, they have to go out, need a transportation. So one of the city council was there. They are talking about see whether they can give us more money.
Right. And the needs exceed what we get in terms of reimbursement. Our needs are astronomical. In working with Principal Kernbach, who's here, is just 3 months ago, it was $180,000 in expenditures. So we have so much higher, and the needs are higher, and having the city help us with just chipping away part of that expenditure really helps. So we have to figure out other ways to look at the transportation question while continuing to get support from the city. Yeah, I think among the 4 schools, I think high school and the middle school need more transportation go out.
Mhm.
So we may figure out, see what is the budget we need.
Right.
So then we can share the input to the city council.
Right.
See they can push.
We're actually working on that right now, and our high school administration has been looking at creative ways to possibly be able to provide our own transportation. Many districts do that. In the past, we have contracted out because we are so small. The challenge in doing that in this current climate is that there's a staffing shortage. So we have found that some of the buses have been late if they show up at all. And sometimes there's not enough staffing at these busing companies, or they have so much turnover. It's not a reliable mode of transportation for our kids any longer. So we are looking at possibly purchasing our own vans.
You also need to buy liability.
Yes, we have liability insurance, and yeah, we do. And we would talk with our JPA about that. And that is a factor that we are discussing and considering, because there's a lot of liability associated with having our own transportation that in the past we haven't really had to take that piece on. But we are looking at all of those factors, and we'll bring back more information to the board.
So the city's reimbursement amount in Prop A forms the core, and then we build around that to supplement and support the sites in terms of transportation needs. Okay, next page, on page 4, we have the projected expenditures. So we looked at revenues, donations, right? Now we look at expenditures. And so the total cost for certificated salaries, these are teachers, counselors, principals, anybody who's certificated, is $17.8 million. Okay. Next is classified salaries is $7.9 million. And then the employee benefits account for $11.6 million. So the bulk of our expenditures is in people. And then we have books and supplies, $3.4 million. And then we have operating services, that's $8.4 million. Now, in between there, you're going to see utilities somewhere in the operating services, right? Utilities. You're going to see $1.56 million. Okay, that's $600,000 more than what we had budgeted in June, because in June, we didn't know how much it was going to be until we started getting those electric bills and water bills. And we're like, okay, we got to add more to this because the budget is a living, breathing document, right? Based on data. And so this number is more accurate now. I hope it's not going to continue to go up, meaning utility costs. I know gas is really expensive now. So we're going to continue to monitor our costs and update the budget accordingly.
So for the utility cost, is that we have a sensor to turn on the lighting or?
Yeah, great. So 5 years ago, we updated the lighting to LED. Now
Even outdoor, like a tennis court or
it's programmed.
yeah.
It's programmed. Yes. And our HVAC system is also centrally controlled, which saves a lot of energy. Yes.
Dr. Lin, as we have pivoted in 2020 into more virtual or electronic textbooks, how has that affected our books and our other supplies? Because I'm hoping we're Xeroxing less. We are getting everything electronically sent to us. Even our board packets are no longer coming to us in hard copies. How has that affected the books and supplies budget?
Yeah, that's something. If we look at the approved textbooks and core curriculum materials line, right below employee benefits, right, you're going to see the $364,000. Okay. If we look to the right, you're going to see it's 58,000 from last year. So from 58,000 to this year, 364,000. That's a large carryover. Something's happening at the sites in which either we're not spending that money that's allocated, or we are saving it for a large purchase. But I know the materials are copyrighted, and even if it's digital, we still have to pay the copywriting. We have to pay for the cost of intellectual property. So it could be the Animage tables, but licensing fees is also instructional materials.
Right.
So it's not like it's free. We have to pay for what people have created.
As we add the programs and yes.
Right.
Thank you.
So there is that carryover amount, which you can see in the budget, which then actually, usually principals will wait until there's a large amount to spend that money all in once, instead of piecemealing and having different editions of textbooks or, licenses. Okay. Next page. Okay, this is our final page. I think we're doing really well with time. I was thinking, oh, this might take a full hour. Okay. So this is the final page. This captures pretty much the bottom line. This is the bottom line page, right? We have, if you look at the total expenditures, this year we're projecting to spend $51.79 million. Okay, so we are deficit spending almost $4 million this year. Okay, we're almost deficit spending. Now, what constitutes that? You're going to see that there is a $4.56 million in special education contributions. So we contribute from the general fund to backfill the total cost of special education, which is mostly an unfunded mandate. And then we have the contribution to maintenance operations. We have aging facilities, and that's going to take $1.3 million of our general fund as well. So the deficit spending is $3.9 million. It's repeated down there again. And then the projected ending balance is $12.2 million. That's what we have left over with revenues and expenditures. So that's our bottom line. Now, that $12.2 million is broken into pieces. If you look at the very bottom section of the components of the ending balance, 3% is statutory. It's statutory. It's required by law. It's designated for economic uncertainties. That accounts for $1.5 million. And then we have school site carryover, which is great. We have $1.5 million in school site carryovers each year. That's a healthy amount. BOE goals, that $1 million, I'm going to talk more about later. And then we have the cash flow reserve, which is $2 million. Future COP payments, we have 1.5 million. Future fiscal stabilization, that's $2 million. Declining enrollment, $2.5 million. And that pretty much accounts for what's in the MYP. I'm going to talk more about each one of those in later slides. Okay, so that's basically getting into the weeds. But it's so important to be able to read this document because I just cover one column, right? One section, which is this year. There are 2 more fiscal years projected into the future. And that's where we look at the long-term health and sustainability of our programs. All right, so back to this, I'm going to go to the next slide. So earlier I mentioned that the budget is a snapshot, right? It is something that we create. It's a model. It is not cash. Where do we get the data? We get the data from the dartboard. It's the governor's budget, and this is the School Services of California. All districts use this within the state of California. This is what we use as independent variables to determine what the budget looks like. And the budget also requires information from stakeholders, from the school board, and looking at, what the needs of the programs are. Okay, so the dartboard forms the basis of how we do these calculations. Okay, next slide, please. Now, school funding is associated with student enrollment. We know that ADA funds us. Enrollment is associated with how we get funded, right? Here's a chart of enrollment in the last 4 years. It is not an eye exam, even though it might appear to be. But if you look at the printout, you're going to see the fine print on the bottom. It is broken into TK or kindergarten all the way to 12th grade for 4 years. So 4 groupings of TK to 12th grade. And for each year in the last 4 years, you're going to see that the average class size, right? That's the line in the middle. You're going to see that line. That's the average of all the grade levels, right? You're going to see that declining. So that is our declining enrollment graph overlaid on top of each grade level in the last 4 years. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is the same data organized a different way. Okay, here's another way to look at the same enrollment data. And each group of 4 years here show how the grade level is doing. The general trend we see in this chart is that we will eventually level off as the peaks graduate out. Okay, this data does not include this year's enrollment data. So this is trend information in the last 4 years. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is the general fund revenues. Given that enrollment is associated with how school districts are funded, for our district, inter-district students account for 30% or $11 million of our revenues. So $11 million brought in by inter-district students account for 110 teachers. That's about 100.
And how many teachers do we have in the district?
About 134.
Right. So this is only if we're talking about teachers, right? That's how many teachers, we're not talking about facilities. We're not talking about utilities, only teachers. That's how many teachers $11 million will buy us, will get us. Okay. All right, next slide, please. And then recently, the voters in California approved Proposition 28, which will provide about $1 billion in funding, not to us, right? To all 1,000 school districts within California to supplement art and music education. And the key word there is supplement, not to supplant, but to supplement. Supplement means it goes above and beyond what we currently have. And so the chart shows how much each school is getting. And Dr. Richter and I will be providing support to our site principals in helping the site principals develop Prop 28 plans. And we want to look at how it's going to be a synergy among the 4 schools in vertical articulation of programs, feeder schools to the middle school being a feeder school to the high school, and having those pathways work in synergy. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the estimates are based on $113.45 per student and an additional $84.15 per low-income household student. The funding will begin next year, 23-24 school year. We are required to submit an annual report. Funds used must be to supplement existing programs, build out of existing programs, and we must certify that 80% of the funding goes to staffing. which provides opportunities for us. Okay, next. Committed funds. We are fortunate to have a very wise and far-sighted Board of Education. With a looming recession, we have fiscal uncertainties that the board has addressed by committing funds made available because of one-time funds from the pandemic. So we've been very creative in using those one-time funds, restricted to free up general fund where possible, where appropriate and possible. And we're able to have a cash flow fund of $2 million to provide the district with higher rating from the credit rating agencies when we look for, when we borrow money, that will help us with our interest rate. This will also allow the district to reduce the need for temporary borrowing. And this is the cash flow fund of $2 million. The COP repayment of $1.5 million allows the district to pay down the balance and the interest of the current COP, which is the certificate of participation. The fiscal stabilization of $2 million allows the district to reduce the severity of inflation in materials and pension costs. Again, the governor didn't provide us with pension relief. So this is, the board's wisdom in providing, a buffer to address that liability. And finally, the declining enrollment of $2.5 million allows the district to buffer against declining enrollment. And basically, it gives us the time to make decisions and make adjustments as needed. So the money there is really time. If you look at the 3% reserve that we have, that's 2 weeks of payroll. Okay, this $2.5 million, maybe that's a month's worth of payroll. So you actually have an extra month, 2 board meetings to address something if something hits us, so it buys us time. Okay. Now, next slide. You're going to see that the 4 board goals. Goal number 1 is develop and implement fiscal health and sustainability. So the committed funds mentioned in the previous slide basically does this. It handles the fiscal health of our district. Also, for goal number 2, to implement the goal, we have $1 million in board for board goals. And culture of service is very important. It's one of the 4 board goals we have here. And I did some cost accounting here to extract the cost, and we're projecting a $420,000 expenditure because we have increased front office positions this year. And,
Each of the schools.
Each of the schools. Front office being, where parents, will have that first experience when they walk into a school, as well as we increased 2 custodial positions for the school sites. And that, the look and feel of our schools is extremely important, especially in this community. So that's $420,000 of the $1 million that we're spending right now. Also, now we have a wall of fame. I don't know if you've seen this right there, a wall of fame. And this is just the tip of the iceberg because it's not just the pictures, it's the celebrations, the acknowledgements, it's the human factor that goes into having the pictures up there. So that's to demonstrate a culture of value and appreciation to SMUSD employees. And last but not least, we also have spent funds to implement dual language immersion. Dr. Richter spearheading that, as well as the medical arts pathway, where team Dr. Delatorre has gotten, donations from the community to augment this $1 million as well, right? It's not just coming out of the board goals, as well as a lot of professional development initiatives to build capacity among staff. So it's not just a one-time use. We want to have this sustainable. We want to get the most bang for our buck in terms of building capacity among our staff through professional development. Okay, next slide, please. So general fund expenditures, you're going to see that the colors are designed for a certain, it communicates a certain message, right? If you look at the same colors, it's basically the cost of personnel, right? That's 73.6% of expenditures represent salaries and employee benefits. So we'll have certificated, classified, and benefits. That's 73.6%. The rest are for equipment, operating services, and books and supplies. These numbers came from the MYP. So this is just a visual of what we saw earlier in the MYP.
And can I say something about that? Typically, in any school district within the state of California, 80 to 85% of the budget is spent on human resources. And so this is, not unusual that you would see 73% of our resources being spent on people. And we are a people business, so clearly we are investing in our students through the professionals that we are hiring to provide support directly to them in instruction in a variety of other areas. But 73% is an amount that is right in line with where we should be and even more conservative than that.
Exactly.
So what is the equipment we budget to buy the 3%?
Yeah, we have the lawnmower, we have trucks, vans, the warehouse, forklifts, things like that.
How about do we buy the computer or?
That's also factored in. Computer equipment, network equipment. E-Ray helps us with the discounts, and Dr. Choi spearheads that.
Do we own the copy machine or we lease?
That's a lease.
Lease, right?
We own just a few, but it just makes sense to lease until it makes more sense to buy. But we buy it, then there's a service component that goes with it.
Yeah.
And that goes into equipment as well. You're right. Yes. Okay. So next slide, please. Okay, this is the, earlier when we talked about the governor's COLA and then the unfunded pension obligations, right? The no pension relief. This is a graphical representation and a tabular representation of what we're talking about. You're going to see that the blue curve is for classified employees. It's just ticking up, right? From, you can see it from this 15%, under 15%, all the way almost to 30%. And this is just for PERS, just the pension piece. But we also have statutory benefits obligations, such as the Social Security, OASDI, Medicare, the SUI, which is the unemployment insurance, and then the workers' comp. So total, for this year alone, total, PERS members who are more than 50%, the district contributes 35% on top of salary. Imagine the salary is 100%, we contribute another 35% that the employee doesn't benefit immediately in terms of their compensation. They'll see it later when they retire. But this is how much the employer, us, the district, will have to contribute to, because this is all required by law. Okay, so this is something that people don't really see or factor in. The minute we look at, as Dr. De La Torre mentioned, the bulk of our expenditures are in people, and it should be that way. But the bulk of a large part now is in terms of these obligations. And this is true in all school districts right now.
So our work comp, the rate is very stable, right? We don't have too many work comp.
So one thing that Dr. Rose and we work on is the risk management piece. We look at it constantly. We look at opportunities to reduce injuries, because it's also a human piece. We don't want any one of our employees to get hurt at work. So, yeah.
But with respect to the cost of workers' compensation, we are part of a JPA where we're pooling our resources with a variety of other school districts in order to be able to manage those costs as effectively as we can, and to get a lower rate. So, yeah. And Dr. Lin and Dr. Rose are attending those board meetings monthly, and are very watchful in terms of what the trends are going to be for the future. Work comp costs are going up, but they are also managed because there are ceilings as to what you can receive for workers' compensation benefits. So it's more controlled and managed than any of the other claims that we're going to get on the property and liability side of the house, which are not as controlled. And so we feel that being a part of this JPA with the other school districts and pooling our resources is a very smart way of managing our money for property and liability and workers' compensation insurance.
Thank you, Dr. De La Torre. Okay, next slide, please, Stephen. Okay, so we have this funding chasm. As mentioned earlier, we do not have any pension relief in the governor's proposed budget. We continue to experience a funding chasm. We saw earlier in the MYP, in the multi-year projections, that we're not a basic aid district, and we do not qualify for high LCFF because of our low unduplicated numbers. So for example, basic aid districts generate anywhere from $21,000 to $27,000 per student. High LCFF districts bring in at least $16,000 per student. These are, local districts like El Monte, Montebello, Azusa. So without local funding, our district generates only $13,560 per student from state and federal revenues. So this is what we're looking at. And, this is where the partnership with our foundation, our PTAs, the army of volunteers, really, they help make the difference in how we are able to deliver state-of-the-art, high-quality educational programs to our students.
And just one more issue I wanted to mention, when we're looking at the funding chasm, that this affects our ability to be competitive with salaries and benefits with all the other school districts around us that get far more supplemental and concentration grant money. This district gets zero concentration grant money. And that is a huge factor for other schools in terms of their negotiations at the bargaining table and their compensation packages. So this is something that we continue to grapple with, but despite that, we have remained very competitive. But as Dr. Lynn said, that is because we have two parcel taxes and a very benevolent and generous San Marino Schools Foundation that works with us to bridge that gap.
And in order to get concentration grant dollars, you have to be 55% unduplicated. Ours is 16%. So we need, not that we're going to get there, but we're way off in even qualifying for concentration grant.
But talk about the formula for concentration grant money. What does that look like? So if you are 55% or above,
Right.
unduplicated, talk to them about how much
you get
that
the
is.
basic apportionment and 50% of that.
Yeah,
Okay, so you get 50% more on top of that. So some districts actually could double their basic amount.
yeah.
Easy. We get $933,000 on top of our $47 million.
Mhm.
So yeah, we get a tiny amount in terms of supplemental, but we qualify for zero concentration.
It's a big difference.
Huge difference. So LCFF really is doing this. It's the reason why we have that chasm. That's the formula is giving us the chasm.
Mhm.
Okay. So next slide, please, Dr. Choi. And so we mentioned this earlier in the NYP. We saw this earlier. The special education unfunded mandate. On top of all the expenses, general fund contributes an additional $4.56 million. So this money comes out of general fund to backfill the mandated costs of special education. For maintenance, again, we have really beautiful tile roofs and et cetera, leaking ceilings occasionally and flooded basements. So it costs us another $1.3 million each year. So
Mhm.
this is where the facility needs exist, as you see in these numbers. Next slide, please. So we had the heat wave. Principal Caldo was in the audience. He could attest to that. He survived that. I think he's stronger because of that. And then flooding. Okay, Mr. Topalian right next to him getting the same therapy. So these were just natural phenomenons, once in a century kind of, but that's happening more and more often. And so the thing is, we have major facilities maintenance needs, right? Infrastructure needs. We were talking about the phones just the other day. We need to communicate better, not just for safety, but just to be more efficient as employees. Cameras, we need those cameras for safety and to capture incidents, right? Fences, the middle school with one-time funds, we're putting up those fences. Locks, we have ways, we need better, more modern locks that could be programmed and reset, as opposed to, if somebody loses a master key, then we're in big trouble. It's going to cost us, it's like a liability that we didn't anticipate. So we're anticipating some of these liabilities in that list, and that, et cetera, right? And then there's the deferred maintenance needs, the roofs, blacktops are cracking open, windows. We saw, just last Sunday walking around the four sites, windows with plywood just boarding it up temporarily at Carver. And we need better facilities for our students.
So with that, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank the Board of Education for their leadership in creating an opportunity for a facilities advisory committee to come together and do all the research that needs to be done to think about and study creative ways that we can address our infrastructure needs, of which there are numerous examples that Dr. Lynn just gave you a few. But we really, really do have tremendous maintenance and operation needs throughout our school district. And, just driving up Huntington, you look at our schools and you think they're beautiful. But when you tour them and you actually get behind the scenes and you can see the underbelly of the schools, we do have some pretty serious issues that need to be addressed that aren't going away anytime soon. And one of the things that was pointed out on that tour with the Facilities Advisory Committee is that when we talk about our new HVAC systems, we're talking about systems that are over 20 years old. They're only new by comparison to the other ones that we have in place. So this is something that the board is recognizing, acknowledging, and really engaging a committee of stakeholders to look at. And so thank you to the Board of Education for recognizing that as an essential need at this point in our history. It's just been incredible that you're willing to do that at this point in time. And thank you for the subcommittee of the board that has been assigned to participate in this process. Because not only do you have board meetings now, but you have facility advisory committee meetings, and you're going on Sundays to tour school sites. And so I want to thank you so much for your commitment and your leadership and your wisdom with respect to that, because that's going to be an ongoing issue that you're going to hear a lot about coming up.
Yeah. To reflect facility maintenance, I'm glad right now we have a facility advisory committee. I'm not in the committee member, so that's reason I like to bring up this issue. So because within a certain time, I think the facility member, they need to come out a package for us. So I want to challenge it, if we will come out a number, so how many % we are addressed in the repair for like deferred maintenance need, and how many % we may have a brand new the building or facility. I think we need to figure out because some maybe too old the building, and we continue to put the money repair. It probably doesn't make sense for the energy, for the energy efficient or whatever, the update for the California code. So that may not practical. So that's the what I like to know what kind of package they will come out to suggest to the board. Yeah.
Thank you so much for asking that question. And what we're doing right now is we're going to go out for RFQ, request for quote, to architectural firms.
Or we may also need the retainer consultant to give us.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the first thing we're going to do is work hard on being able to assess what our infrastructure needs are. We need a needs assessment done by an architectural firm. And so the last time we had that done was in 2015-16, I believe. And so we're going to do that. We're in the process of doing that now. We're going to have a needs assessment and a facilities master plan. So the needs assessment looks at the actual infrastructure needs of our school district's facilities. The facilities master plan takes into consideration what the Board of Education's vision is for our education in the future. So what does education at San Marino High School look like 10 years from now, right? That is something that the Board of Education is going to be working on in the future through the strategic planning process. And in order for us to get there, we also have to look at through this firm, and the firm will also help us with the master plan, which will be folded into one report. That is going to be work that you have empowered your facilities advisory committee to do alongside these consultants who are going to create the professional plan. That's the process. And then they bring all of that back to the Board of Education. And the Board of Education will make some decisions at that time with that information.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? All right, are you done?
About this? No.
Yeah.
Next one. Okay. So looking ahead, staff will present the second interim report in our next regular meeting on March 14th. We continue to have district leadership budget meetings. We continue to assess and evaluate student enrollment, staffing, programs, services in relation to school site and district budgets. And in May, we're looking at the May revision from the governor. Usually the May revise is based on the April 15th deadline for tax returns, tax income reporting. This year, for 75% of our state, the extensions to October 15th. So this year is going to be interesting as to how that May revise is going to help us in terms of budget planning. So, you know, that slide that says economic uncertainties ahead, it's no joke. It's like we really don't know because we have so many other variables that are like out of whack right now. It's no longer April 15th, it's October 15th. The May revise usually helps us. We may not even get good information to plan. So the recommendation, of course, is to be cautious in the planning process.
Thank you, Dr. Lin. But I want to take this opportunity to really kind of, on behalf of the board, to thank the leadership. And it began with Dr. Wilson a couple of years back when we charged him and asked him, what do we need to do to prepare post-pandemic? And he really positioned our district in a very good place where we were able to take advantage of the funding. Thank you, Dr. Delatorre and her cabinet, because under Dr. Lin, and then the two of you guys working with our education programs, our staffing, our technology needs, that's what's coming together. That's why we have this picture in this scenario that we have for the next 2 to 3 years. And so on behalf of the board, thank you so much for all of your work and your dedication, because it really does take all of us to look at it and collaborate and work together. So thank you, Board of Education. And then in our audience, we also have our principals and our staff here. Thank you to each of you, because we really are looking for all of us to pull together to make sure that our district can fulfill the vision and the goals of this school district. And we are in such a good place because of all of your contributions as well. So thank you.
Thank you, President Ryan. You have questions.
Thank you. So thank you. This is amazing. Takes me a lot to understand what I'm looking at. So I appreciate this, and I appreciate the bigger font. I did have a couple of questions. The enrollment trends and projections that were by year and by class in the presentation. I don't have a slide number, sorry.
11 and 12.
11, 12, thank you. Those two, the big bar graphs. So when we're talking about these enrollment, so let me preface all this by saying a couple of things. So I know that this multi-year budget goes out to when we are allowed to do the average ADA. So my first question is, what are we looking at in terms of a drop in funding after that 24-25 year when we don't have that soft landing anymore? And then my second question has to do with the enrollment trends and projections. I think I heard you say that they are leveling off as we see the peak classes come out.
Yep.
So I guess if you can elaborate on that conclusion.
Yeah. So this is just a model, right? The MYP is a model, and we look at data. This is one data point. Now, if you look at this is by year. So there are 4 years here, 4 groups of years, right? So that's 2019, 20, 21, 22. You're going to see those lines right there. They graduate out. That's the final line is the senior year. And you see that there were 4 right there in 2019, 3 in 2020, 2 in 2021, and 1 in 2022. The 2022 is the 21-22 school year, which is the last year. The last group that graduated out. After that, you see it kind of levels off, right? Couple that with the increasing enrollment at the elementary, we're looking at a, snake eating a large meal going, So hopefully, we don't have a crystal ball, but this is just 2 data points right there. The elementary and then the high school with 12th grade seniors leaving. we have the $2.5 million in committed funds for declining enrollment. So we're situating the board in the board's first goal, right? Is fiscal solvency, fiscal stability. That's what we're talking about.
Okay, so we're really looking at when we do see that end of the ADA average, that's where the 2.5 committed funds sort of will kick in and help soften that for us.
Assuming the averaging is still the case in May.
Because it's possible we may by that point actually come back up again to
Right.
something at a level where we're not losing the money. Okay.
If the state doesn't have the revenues at that time, they're gonna say, well, sorry,
Yeah.
districts.
So, and I have to give credit to our principals for really working hard on giving people tours, accommodating, requests to come in and look at what our programs really have to offer students. And I continue to get emails from our principals that they're sharing with me. One came from Principal Kurtenbach today, from parents who are thanking our principals for taking the time and just expressing how impressed they are with our programs in San Marino. So our principals have really been over backwards to increase enrollment and awareness by marketing their schools in a very, very high level way and a very impactful way. So thanks to the 4 principals for doing all of that work, because we are seeing that it is making a difference and we are moving the needle. And so if we can stabilize and possibly even increase our enrollment through their work, through elevating our programs in all 4 A's, I think we're going to be in really good shape.
And then my second question is a little bit convoluted, a little bit theoretical.
Oh, okay. You did have 2 questions. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, was that not my second? Do you want to go back?
No, you go
Okay,
ahead.
so I guess my question has to do with one-time funding, with the federal dollars and the COVID programs, and the increased categorical funding we're seeing coming from the state. For example, they had the music and art and music one, and then they cut that in half with the January revise. And then when we're looking at board goals, and I love that we added the custodial and the front office positions, but those are one-time funds essentially if we're pulling it from the board goals as an accounting practice. So in looking forward, then how are we looking to pay for those programs if that money is taken away or lost? Or
So the feeling about that is if we increase our enrollment based on an increased service to community, to our parents, it pays for itself ongoing, right? Every student that comes through the door is $1,300. I'm sorry, $13,000.
Stay in federal, yep.
Yeah, from state and federal. So you can do the math if you get 10 kids, right? That more than pays for that salary ongoing. And that's what we're looking at doing. And that's what we believe, the board had the vision to be able to see as a goal. And it is paying off, as I just said. So we're really making great strides in that area.
so we're really looking at using those one-time funds more as investments.
Yeah, to start
And
doing
growing.
the work.
Okay.
Mhm.
It's a catalyst to jumpstart
Yeah.
that feeling, right? That culture of service.
Mhm.
Anecdotally, Principal Cadwell today was so happy visiting the budget office saying,
Uh-huh.
here's $20,000 donated by a family, because they're so happy
Right.
with the school. And that I'm sure that's the case at the other 3 schools too.
That's a great
that's
example.
so important.
Mhm.
I think that's the human side of that investment.
What I find impressive is I was looking at all of our budget, what we adopted in June versus where we are after all of the revisions and increases and all of that. And what it's impressive is that the staff, both at the site level and at the district level, every time a little bit of money came in, they said, how are we going to spend this on the kids? I mean, it's amazing because the alignment between the increased revenue and the increased expenditures is amazing. It's so precise. It's really impressive because instead of just dumping it into something or into a box that we never know where it's going to be spent, this is going, every single dollar that comes in just keeps going back to our kids, which is just phenomenal. And it's so incredibly impressive because everybody's just paying attention to every single detail. So thank you. Sorry.
All right, next 4C, this is San Marino High School block scheduling. I'd like to invite Principal Kurtenbach and Vice Principal Kassam Clay. They will lead the board in a discussion on block scheduling.
Good afternoon. Thank you, President Ryan. Thank you, Dr. De La Torre, members of the board. We come to you today just to do a review of our planned rollout for block scheduling next year. We can go to the next slide. There we go. So there's a multitude of reasons for moving toward a block schedule. These are just a few of them that we focused on. Primarily, we want to always be making any substantive changes at the high school for instructional and learning reasons. So obviously, our first reason is to engage students in those learning activities at a deeper level by providing more time for our teachers and our students to be together in class. They can develop new activities and spend more time on mastering the skills and concepts of their particular curriculum each day. Additionally, because they're only focusing on 3 classes per day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, allows for a deeper focus, less homework, and more intention when you're thinking about those courses that day. There's less stress for students. All of the relevant research shows that when you have less to focus on, you're able to reduce your stress. I'm sure you would all agree that that's the case in your own lives. So it only makes sense that it would be the same for students as well as staff. Additionally, students will be able to take additional courses in dual enrollment, potentially join the Medical Arts Academy, and they'll spend less time missing class for athletics based on the way that we've designed our schedule and the way that we currently have our league games scheduled throughout our athletics. Well, I guess I get my own here. Let's see if I press the right one. This is what our schedule will be next year. It's a little bit hard to read, but I think you guys have printouts. We've already printed posters, so we're ready to do that come the beginning of next year. You'll notice we have an A day and a B day. A day is 1-3-5. B day is 2-4-6. That's A day is Monday, Wednesday. B day is Tuesday, Thursday. And then we have Titan Day, which is Friday. That's where you see all of your teachers. This is generally referred to as a modified block schedule, meaning that you don't have a block every single day. Fridays, you'll notice that at 2:50, students are released to go home. We've eliminated the homeroom on Fridays. I feel that that's probably best given the number of athletic events that typically occur on Fridays. A lot of the after-school events such as dances, the move towards the weekend. And we have enough instructional minutes where we could afford to do that. And thanks to the feedback of the staff, it's something we looked at and it was something that we could do. So we thought it would be best to do that. The minimum day is important because we do have quite a few minimum days on our calendar. This aligns very closely, if not identically, with Huntington Middle School. The rationale for kind of how this is all set up is to align with Huntington Middle School's non-block schedule because we do share staff and we do plan to continue to do that not only next year, but in the ongoing years to come. You'll notice that there is a homeroom in both the A and the B day that is extended beyond what we currently have. Right now, we have 15-minute homeroom that's attached to fourth period. This will be a homeroom that is at the end of the day. You might be asking, what about seniors? Seniors don't typically need a lot of homeroom time. However, when we do want to use our seniors in homeroom, say to give them relevant instruction regarding their applications for college, we will just have what we call a closed campus, and we'll probably have them move to the web theater, which is a nice intimate place where we can have specific topics of need to them only. But we wanted to give them the opportunity to have that additional time because they do need it to do things like apply for college, write their personal statement, and then we'll talk about the opportunities potentially for internships. We also have a lot of students who seniors get jobs, and that's very, very good for them when they're applying to college because it allows them to really speak to what they're passionate about in a lot of ways and shows that they've taken on a responsibility that is not typical for everyone their age group. And we'll be able to come back to this in a moment. These are just a few of the benefits that we pretty much plan to recognize next year. I think there's going to be more as we implement this. But you can see that this increases our ability to meet the needs of students in a multitude of ways, not just instructionally, but through wellness, social emotional learning, as well as student support for academic courses they may be struggling in. One of the big things that we're seeing as we get towards the end of the year, things get very tight in terms of time. At the high school, we have to do, and you all just learned about IEPs. We have to do transition meetings with Huntington Middle School. So we're bringing their students up to us. That's anywhere from 12 to 20 meetings, depending on how many students. We also have exit meetings for all of our seniors. That's anywhere from 12 to 20 additional meetings as well. Those all have to happen during our contractual day. And that puts a lot of stress and pressure on Mr. Casey and myself because you have to have an administrator at those meetings. So this will allow us with that homeroom time to begin those meetings earlier in the day, provide an opportunity for all teachers to attend those meetings as well as the 504 meetings. So I'm really excited about that because that's going to help us in supporting those students. We'll be able to run intervention courses potentially during homeroom. Right now, we do all of our interventions after school. And if you're like me, if I'm struggling somewhere, it's very difficult to get me to put extra time into that thing I'm struggling at. That's the thing I avoid. Students do that too. So asking a student to stay after school to work on something that they struggle in, it's a very big ask and it's very difficult to get them there. However, if they're at a homeroom, we can just pull them right in and start giving them that support. We find that when we get our kids in, they actually do really well and they connect with those intervention teachers and support staff. We'll have an opportunity to increase access to PCC dual enrollment because of the way that our schedule is designed. We can teach PCC classes during the school day. We couldn't do that before because our classes were too short. Now that our classes are longer and they're broken up similarly to a college going environment, provides us the opportunity to offer that time in a different place. So we're hoping to attract more professors. So also allows our staff, if they meet PCC's requirements, to teach those courses because again, it's during the school day. That is why we're able to pull off the Medical Arts Academy. Were it not for the shift to block schedule, I can confidently say that the Medical Arts Academy would have not been able to then begin next year. Oh, I have a slide. Finally, this is some of the preparation that we've done thus far. Thanks to Dr. Richter, we have used some of the funds that we've got for professional development in the past couple of years that we got out of COVID, as well as some of the funds that we've received this year to provide an additional 20 hours of professional development, planning time, and curriculum adjustments to every single staff member at the high school. We are providing them with a block schedule of professional development through BER, that's the Bureau of Educational Research. If any of you have ever worked with them, probably not so much the board, but our members of cabinet have. It is very high quality. They don't do things unless there is a data-driven educational benefit. This is a 6-hour training that we've purchased basically the recording to because they're on the East Coast. And not too many staff want to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to begin that and then stay online all day. So they'll have access to that to work through it as they wish with their departments and colleagues. We've also provided our staff the opportunity to have a day of professional development of their choice. So let's say that I wanted to work with Dr. Choi on our curriculum. He and I could determine that we wanted to do that next Tuesday. Tell Ms. Moggio we get subs, they get to take, we get to take time out to plan, adjust our curriculum, look at new activities, potentially find a different professional development, which is another opportunity we've afforded our staff. So I have a lot of staff who are going into project-based learning professional development because they see the opportunity now that they have the time to work with students. And they're finding it in various areas. So for example, BER has project-based learning for math and English, but not so much for CTE and VAPA. But Michelle Pauline found one in a different area. We evaluated that together. And so she's going to take that PD. Additionally, many staff are contacting teachers around our area who are already on block schedule, especially those who most recently transitioned. Some are going to La Cañada to observe and discuss with those teachers how they made the transition several years ago, and some are going to South Pasadena who made the transition, I believe, not too long ago, probably within the last 5 years. Colleague to colleague, it is determined by the staff what they need. We've given them a lot of resources. We're clearing time and support. You'll notice that all of our Tuesdays from here on out, except for a few based on the needs of the site. So for example, Mr. KC is going to be running some CASP training. So the English and math teachers will lose one of those hours. But by and large, our staff will get approximately 40 hours of additional training to make the switch over to block. Cost and possible concerns. It's hard to say. We've not done this before. Will there be unintended consequences? Of course there are. Anytime you try something new, there's that, oh my goodness, I didn't think of that moment. However, every time we present, we discuss, we go back and forth with staff, parents, students, we discover something else and we try to mitigate that to the best of our abilities. I feel like we have done as much as we can at this point. Now it comes down to planning and preparation between now and the start of school. I'm here all summer, so we're going to have a significant amount of time dedicated to helping any staff who want to stay around, work in their classrooms. Change typically results in challenges for some, especially at the start. We are relying on our ability to work with each other as colleagues. I think because you're going to have 3 classes and you're going to be able to focus on those daily, you're going to find opportunities within the challenges. One of the things we tell our staff is, you have sort of a rhythm to your class right now. You have a 54-minute rhythm, and every staff member can tell you what that is. Here's my do now when I get into class. While my kids are doing the do now, here's what I'm doing. Then I go through my lesson. Then there's I do, you do, we do. There's all of these little rhythms into the class. So when people say, how are you going to fill that time? You're going to find that rhythm. There's going to be an up and a down. Are you going to sit there for the entire period and just focus really hard? No, you're going to have little breaks here and there. It might be a break that looks a lot like, what we do when we take a snack break. It might be 5 minutes where let's just relax for a second, talk to your friends, just kind of walk around the classroom, stretch your legs. It might be a break where, okay, we're going to get into the group and we're going to do some group work versus individual focused learning. Every curriculum is going to be slightly different. Some of the things we're excited for that we're seeing as real cool opportunities. You can do an entire lab as well as begin a lab report and work with your classmates without having to go home and try to reconnect. Same goes for projects. We're very much encouraging our staff to move away from assessment in the summative sense that we're typically used to, test. Because you have students there longer, you can do project-based assessments. We're very much encouraging our staff to reduce homework. Not just because block schedule helps with that, but because when you go home, everybody's got one of these, and I've used ChatGPT a couple of times to help me write a few things. Gives you a lot of advice and a lot of good ideas. So why wouldn't our kids use that as well? Have them do the learning in front of you, have them doing the demonstration of their learning in front of you. And we feel like block is really going to support their ability to do that. We're at question time. And I'll obviously let Carlos talk because he has a lot of ideas too.
Go ahead, Mrs. Chong.
She already saw my notes, my chicken scratching. So in the past, there were concerns about specific areas while people were talking about block scheduling, like English language learners, foreign language, math and science instruction, where that lack of continuous daily instruction, special education may have a negative impact on their instruction. Can you speak to how you might be addressing some of that or how the teachers are looking to address it?
Yeah, I think a lot of the positives that you see with just moving to block is also positive for our English language learners. So we've also in the last 2 years revamped our ELD program significantly. So a lot of our, so for example, it depends, right? So it may be every other day that they're getting that English instruction, or it may not, and it may be a lot more intense. So for example, if you have an ELD learner that's at a level 1 or level 2, you know, they lack basic fluency and they need to build those skills. We typically will put them in 2 ELD classes. So they would have an ELD class every other day for an hour and 45 minutes. For our students who are in levels 3 and 4, we still put them in that ELD course. They're getting individualized instruction, but they're also in their English course as well. So they're getting that every single day. So it's still there. That's, you know, thanks to kind of the way that we revamped and based on best practices. But that's basically going to allow for a lot deeper instruction, and that's better, especially when you're starting to build fluency, that's what they need as they transition to kind of an ELA only schedule, as opposed to, you know, leaving off those ELD classes as they progress.
In terms of students with special needs, you can also use that homeroom period and assign them back into their SAI classroom. It's not necessarily a service, but you're back with that teacher who can provide that support. You could also understand that that student typically struggles in math and not so much in English. So then you could have them enrolled in the homeroom of their math teacher. We couldn't do any of that before. You were in your 4th period class. If that happened to be your math teacher, then good, you got that. Now we have a little bit more flexibility. In terms of the things like sciences and English, students who typically struggle will, I think, do better because their focus is not divided. It is more focused. So now students with special needs typically demonstrate that through executive functioning, planning. Now it's just 3 courses. It's not 6 or sometimes 7 if you have a 0 period, or 8 if you have athletics after school. Now it's just those 3 courses, maybe 4 if you have a 0, and then you have athletics. So we've reduced the amount of stress, the amount of planning, and increased their ability to be kind of more effective on their own.
May I add something to that? So in our discussions with Jason and Carlos regarding block scheduling and the gift of time, particularly for students who are struggling, our English learners, our students who need the enrichment piece, I think having that extra time for each period allows them not only the opportunity to learn, and it's going to go back to the I do, you do, we do, but the opportunity to reinforce their learning. So students are engaged in inquiry-based learning, project-based learning. So they're getting the content, whether it's through explicit instruction or direct instruction, and then given the opportunity, because they have that time, to apply their learning. Whereas in a regular classroom prior to block scheduling, students after 50 something minutes would have to leave and not have that opportunity to apply what they've learned immediately. It also allows time for students to collaborate. So for your English learners, it allows them the time to engage in dialogue with their English learner peers or non-English learner peers, because that's what they need, whether it's through small group instruction or collaboration or project-based learning. So it, you know, in essence, it's a win-win for students who need that additional support, as well for students who need that enrichment piece.
Our flagship programs are also going to flourish. If you think about visual and performing arts, except for maybe vocal music, which Mr. Jameson has reminded me, it's really difficult to sing for an hour, much less 2. But he's already kind of developing a way in which he's going to modify the class. Think about this if you're doing orchestra. It takes probably 20 minutes to set up. Now you're left with 25 minutes of instruction, but you also have to put away. So you're really left with about 15. Now you have at least a full hour of rehearsal. You think about our musical Chicago, which I expect all of you to be at either tomorrow night, Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, possibly Sunday. Dr. Lynn may be covering for us. But the rehearsals that our kids for Chicago go through run late into the evening. Now imagine that the high level drama program is 6 period. You've got 6 attached right to the end of the school day. You can put 3 to 4 hours of rehearsal together, and it's only 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So there's opportunities here for the programs that, and it's not that math and science aren't great, but those aren't the things people run around and post on the internet, right? So these programs will be allowed to flourish. Our dance program will be allowed to do some more amazing things. As it is, Ms. Shen is going to be visiting our elementary and our middle school, and she's inviting them to participate in dance, et cetera. How great will it be when her 6th period class can go down to Carver and spend 2 to 3 hours there and go through each one of their classrooms, not without a lot of stress and pressure. Those kids will be able to do a lot more as well. When we think about all of the concerns, I remind everybody, we're not the first to have done this. This has been done for decades, and some of the most amazing high schools in the nation, in the state, in the world, function this way. There's a reason why colleges and universities don't do period by period by period and have you go to every class every day. And there's a reason why you all don't operate in your work the same way. You have focuses, you have things that you know today is about this. And that's what we're trying to provide for our students, is that opportunity to have that college going environment, deep learning, and understand that this is how the world works outside of the high school. And now it'll work that way within the high school.
Sorry, one more quick question. I just realized period 0, what classes are those? Because they're not getting all these amazing benefits. Because they're not getting the 5:30.
Right now, it's just marching band and potentially our symphony orchestra. The only reason really is because those are really large classes and it's access to the field. So, you know, if we could figure out a way to do it differently, we obviously would, but right now that's it. A lot of people have talked about moving other classes in there. We don't see the need. We're able to get kids into the classes that they want. I think it is important that we follow the law the way that it's written. I think it was intended to do good things, and you can kind of tell. You can tell the difference with a lot of students who are able to do pretty well. And as a matter of fact, because we start late and we've had some students who need accommodations even this year, we might give them period 1 off, and getting to come in a little bit later even helps a few of those students. So I'm seeing it as it's good overall to not have 0 period. It's there if we need it, but we try not to plan around it, because you can't make staff do it. You have to ask them. They can say no. And so if you plan to have 0s and your staff's like, I don't want to get up at 6:30. I kind of like coming in at 8:30. You're not going to be able to pull that off. So.
Mr. Chang.
So with implementing the block schedule, so you also talking about the outside internship. So when we have a time.
Oh, okay. So talk about
yeah.
how an internship would be structured.
So what we would probably do, and I'll let Mr. KC talk more about this, because we're really developing a robust list of places where students can be interning. What we'll probably want to do is align that with our 6th period. The biggest challenge for getting an internship with a student is finding the time to do it, and getting them access to whatever program or place that they're going to. So having it aligned with either 5th period, which would end on Monday, Wednesday, or 6th period, which would end on Tuesday, Thursday, is the best way for them to be successful, because they could go off campus to the internship and stay there versus coming back and forth. Potentially, you could do something in the morning, period 1 or period 2. That's probably a little more challenging for different places that would accept interns. But the block schedule really does allow for a lot of growth in that area. And as you know, we've made some connections with USC in terms of our Medical Arts Academy, but we're definitely not stopping there. Mr. KC and the counselors have already begun to reach out to various organizations to build a group of internship opportunities that we can then provide to our seniors once they've completed not just the Medical Arts Academy, but different pathways through AP capstone.
There's also some other benefits we can also mention is our Caltech STEM course in Honors Humanities, which would benefit greatly. You know, a couple years ago, we actually made the decision they used to go weekly. Of course, the cost of buses is just exorbitant. So they go every other week now, but now with the schedule, they get that extra time back. So they have that extra hour. So it's basically what it used to be. They'll have that extra time there, especially when we can structure it, maybe with lunch, and there's certain things we can do master schedule wise to maybe expand that time even more. So there's definitely some positives there as well, but also, as we've begun to kind of rebuild the Caltech STEM course this year, what I discovered is that a lot of the students will work with the grad students independently. They'll come in on Saturday. They do a lot outside. And I'm thinking to myself, this is great experience. It's basically an internship, but it's even better than that because they're doing something that they're really engaged in. It's associated with the class, but they're taking it a step further. So it allows for those students, so if they don't have a 5th or a 6th period, they have this large gap of time, they can just, stroll down the block and meet with their graduate student that they're working on, that they're working with and with their project. So there's other possibilities as well that we can work out and formalize down the road. Just thinking right now about some other things, it brings a lot of possibilities, master schedule wise, but instructionally as well, to give our students more opportunities, as opposed to kind of our schedule right now, which is asks a lot of our students. If you think about it, going to 6 classes a day is organizationally like pretty difficult. Keeping that all in line and together is really difficult. So there's lots of possibilities. We're excited.
Yeah, I want to say one more thing about that. If you think about this, if I ask a teacher to teach 4 preps, I have to get the union to sign off on it. That's 4 classes for a teacher, 4 different classes, probably still within the same discipline. So if you're teaching English 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, 8, I have to go get extra permission. But I'm telling students that they have to do 6 different classes in 6 different disciplines. And some of them are taking all APs. Maybe they're in Caltech and Honors Humanity, and they're in the musical. We've just reduced the amount of time and focus for that day in half, and increased the amount of time they have in each class based on how we wrote the schedule. So not only did we shift the amount of stress down, but we increased the amount of learning time. I'd challenge you to find another school that did that.
And I want to go back to actually one of the concerns, and we've been talking a lot with the staff over the last 2 months about it. But and as I've had observations with teachers and we've been debriefing, one of the biggest annoyances of block schedule is you might have 2 classes, let's say 1st and 3rd period, that are right on, like where you want them to be. 5th period doesn't get there, whatever. Something may happen, 10 kids are absent, some things happen, right? And then you have 2, how do you do that? And you have a gap in between, what do you do? And with a lot of teachers have been discussing like, oh yeah, what about that? Like, what do you do when you have 2 ahead? And so that's as instructionally for a teacher, is thinking about that. Okay, well, how do I align it? At first, it's like, oh no, they're days ahead of each other or they're behind. But actually, having more time allows you to play with it a little bit better. Instead of having that 50 minutes, you have that 105 minutes to where then you can adjust the different activities for the different classes. Mm-hmm. It's different though. And that's kind of scary, especially and logistically. So, and the way I've explained and the way I've kind of discussed it with, at least it's come up in at least 5 to, I'll say, well, more than 5 conversations with teachers is you kind of have to think of it, we're putting the burden of the organization and the planning on our shoulders where it should be and taking it off their shoulders. We want them to be there and to think deeply. We'll organize it. We'll figure it out. We'll plan it out. That's our job. But it is different for us. And I think we have to acknowledge that for our teachers, that is a big task, especially when we've had a schedule for, as long as we can remember here. Right. Yeah. So, I think we just have to have some grace with everyone when we get into it and we start doing it. I went into block schedule and never taught in block schedule before. And they're like, here you go. And just had to kind of figure it out. What helped me was just collaborating with the teachers around me. And just seeing how their resources and how they would go about it, and then eventually developing my own method. So there's going to be a learning curve, but you have the gift of time. which allows you to kind of play with that. You know, you don't have those constraints and the kind of empty time, the passing periods as much. Because what Mr. Kernbach explained at the beginning and the end of class is true for music. It's also true for normal classes.
Mm-hmm.
You have that dead kind of that 5 minute. You want them to have a sense of urgency in every class, but now you have more time to play with, and that creates instructional challenges in how you plan. Yeah, we're there to support them through that.
Anyone else? A couple of questions. First of all, you guys talk a lot about increasing instructional time because we've pulled away from all the passing periods, right? And so you've, I guess, built it into the homeroom. In terms of taking attendance, right? Your period 5, let's say, for example, with 80 minutes, 90 minutes, it's still marked as, so if I'm absent period 5, I'm still marked absent 1 period, correct?
Right. Correct.
Okay, and so you're having our teachers just take attendance as if it's 1 hour or 1 period for each of these?
Correct.
And so then if I'm a senior and I've got an internship or I've got a job, would I have 5th period, whichever one I pick, right? Would I have 5th period? That's my free period. So I'm off campus. So that means I don't have to stay there for lunch. I'm leaving at 12:20. And so I'm going to go there. And then do I have to come back for homeroom? I guess no.
No.
Right. So I'm leaving at 12:20. I'm going to my job or my internship. How will I get the attendance for that? Or I don't.
So
I do.
So our ADA is calculated by you just showing up for 1 period. So once a student shows up for a period, they count in ADA for that day. It's not a per period ADA. So, and if you're not enrolled, you're not losing ADA. All of our students are required as seniors to take 5 courses minimally. Most students, I'd say about half, take 1 period off, either 6th period now or 1st period.
So I come to 1st period. And if I'm absent, because I have a dental appointment, then I have an internship or a job, I'm still marked there for the whole day and we're getting ADA.
You're marked by your period. And as long as you've attended 1 period, we get ADA for that day for that student. So if I come to school for period 1 and I'm in period 1, I count as ADA for that school day. Even if my mom pulls me out to go to a dentist appointment for period 3, and then I'm a senior, so I don't have a 5th period and I'm not there the rest of the day. What we're going to be encouraging our parents to do is, of course, take the opportunity of, you have a later start. So ideally you do it at the beginning of the day. Maybe you miss a half hour because, you know, most dentists or doctors don't open quite that early. And then, or you do it at the end of the day. Or maybe you shoot for your Friday because you're out a little bit early. Or you look at our minimum days. We'll have 13 of them next year. So there's a lot of opportunity to wiggle in between that. I'm not too concerned about that because of the way that ADA rules currently work. I guess if they change them to per period ADA, that'll be a bit of an issue. But if you're not enrolled because you don't need 6 periods, it's not going to be an issue. So yeah, there will be some kids, and we've talked to our seniors about this, especially those who have, designs on, I do want to get a job, or I would like to go do an internship. You know, if you get your parents to permit you to be off campus during lunch, there could be 2 days a week where you're done at 12:20. And that to me is appropriate. That's kind of giving them those wings that we need them to have before they step out of San Marino into the greater world of education and have to kind of manage their own selves. This gives them the opportunity to learn what it's like to fly on their own a little bit, while still having us to catch them if they fall. But ADA wise, this will have no effect whatsoever.
And we'll dabble in that next year with internships. This will be primarily a 24-25 issue, and also on Friday, if I have a 5th period off, and it works out well Monday, Wednesday, but what do I do? 6th period.
So that's
we can figure those things out. But yeah, that's kind of that those are the benefit outweighs the potential cost there.
Yeah, if I had a fifth period off, say on a Friday, then everybody would just be asked to go to the library. And honestly, we have kids who come on campus at 8:30 who don't have a class. And they just sit in the campus, nice and quiet, talk to their friends, which again is a learning opportunity for our seniors, because that's what college is like. Oh, I got a free period. I'm not going to go all the way back to my dorm or my apartment. Let's just hang out here. What are we going to do? Well, maybe that's where we can think about starting a club, or I can go in and meet with my counselor and get a few of my college questions asked. Again, opportunity opens up. There are challenges, and it's good for us to recognize them. And we've talked about the fifth period off thing, and we're going to do our best to not have that be the period off. It'll be 1 or 6. But there may be a need to put some of our students in a fifth period off because of the way that the master schedule shakes out. So what do? We entrust our students to be as great as they are right now, because they do a fantastic job. And we have kids who have different programs after school that have 6th period off. They don't want to go all the way home. They sit in the quad and they do great. And a lot of it is additive. Some of them will even come in the office and help out. Some of them will go to classrooms where their teachers want them to be supported, and they do that too. So again, there's actually everything we've run into has opened us up to more opportunity than any sort of real concerns. And I think it's really exciting. I've never been this excited about starting a school year, because the potential for really cool things to happen. So we talk about it, we tell our kids to do cool things, do cool stuff. And they're going to be able to do some cool stuff. And they're going to bring us ideas, and we're going to go, wow, I never thought about that. Let's see if we can give that a shot. A lot of kids have come to us and said, could we have like different clubs meet at that time, like during homeroom? Yeah, we probably could do that, couldn't we? We could have your clubs do club meetings during that time. We could have, if we manage it right, maybe we put ASB there so they could have a little extended time there. We just don't know yet. But everybody's starting to shift their perspective from, oh my gosh, I'm so worried about what this is going to be, to, oh my gosh, this could be really cool. And there could be some neat stuff that I've never thought of before. And now I can think about that. And we're encouraging everybody to bring us those cool ideas and concerns. But so far, it's been mostly cool ideas.
Thank you. All right. If nothing further, I'd like to adjourn the meeting. Okay.
The last 2